Hello everyone, welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's stories. In the summer of 1974, young women across the Pacific Northwest began disappearing. They vanished from college campuses, from parks, from busy streets in broad daylight. What made these disappearances particularly unsettling wasn't just their frequency, but their pattern. The victims were all remarkably similar: young, attractive women with long, dark hair parted in the middle. They were students, workers, daughters with bright futures ahead of them, and they were vanishing without a trace. What the public didn't know yet was that they were witnessing the beginning of one of the most prolific and devastating serial killing sprees in American history. The man responsible didn't fit anyone's idea of what a killer should look like. He was handsome, charming, and intelligent. He was studying law at the University of Washington, volunteering at a crisis hotline, and working on political campaigns. He seemed like the kind of man any parent would be proud to have their daughter bring home. His name was Theodore Robert Bundy, though most people called him Ted. To his friends and colleagues, he appeared to be the embodiment of success and charm. He was articulate, well-dressed, and possessed an almost magnetic charisma that drew people to him. Women found him attractive and trustworthy. Men respected his intelligence and ambition. He was the kind of person who seemed destined for great things, perhaps a career in politics or law, maybe even higher office. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lived something else entirely. Ted Bundy was a predator of extraordinary cunning and ruthlessness. Between 1974 and 1978, he would sexually assault and kill at least 28 women across multiple states, though some investigators believe the true number may be much higher. He didn't just kill his victims, he tormented them, and he reveled in the power he held over them in their final moments. What made Bundy particularly dangerous wasn't just his willingness to kill, but his ability to blend seamlessly into society. He understood how to manipulate people's trust, how to appear vulnerable when he needed help, and how to project an image of respectability that made him nearly invisible to law enforcement. For years, he would kill with impunity, always staying one step ahead of the investigators who were slowly beginning to realize they were dealing with something unprecedented. This is the story of how Ted Bundy terrorized America for nearly a decade, and how justice was finally served. It's a story that changed how we think about serial killers, how we understand the nature of evil, and how we recognize that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who look exactly like the people we trust most. The first confirmed victim was Linda Ann Healy, a 21-year-old University of Washington student who disappeared from her basement bedroom in a house she shared with other students on January 31, 1974. Linda was a psychology major who worked part-time at a ski resort and was known for her reliability and responsibility. When her housemates found her bed empty on the morning of February 1, with sheets stained with blood and her nightgown hanging in the closet, they knew immediately that something terrible had happened. The discovery of Linda's disappearance sent shockwaves through the University of Washington campus and the surrounding Capitol Hill neighborhood. This wasn't a case of a young woman going missing after a night out, this was an abduction from what should have been the safety of her own bedroom. The blood evidence suggested violence, but there was no sign of a struggle elsewhere in the house, no indication of how someone had gained entry, and no witnesses to what had occurred. Seattle police initially treated Linda's disappearance as an isolated incident, but as the weeks passed, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. On March 12, 1974, Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student at Evergreen State College in nearby Olympia, vanished while walking to a jazz concert on campus. Like Linda, Donna was young, attractive, and had long dark hair. Like Linda, she simply disappeared without a trace. The disappearances continued with terrifying regularity. Susan Elaine Rancourt, an 18-year-old biology major at Central Washington University, vanished on April 17, 1974, after leaving her dormitory to attend a German-language film on campus. Roberta Kathleen Parks, a 22-year-old University of Oregon student, disappeared on May 6, 1974, while walking to her dormitory after having dinner with friends. Brenda Carol Ball, a 22-year-old who had been out dancing at a tavern, was last seen on June 1, 1974, leaving the establishment alone. What made these cases particularly troubling for investigators was not just their frequency, but their apparent randomness. The victims came from different colleges, different social circles, different backgrounds. They had disappeared from different locations, some from their homes, others from public places. There seemed to be no connecting thread except for the physical appearance of the victims. All were young women with long, dark hair, usually parted in the middle. The case that would eventually provide the first real clues about the killer occurred on July 14, 1974, at Lake Sammamish State Park, a popular recreational area east of Seattle. It was a beautiful summer day, and the park was crowded with families, couples, and young people enjoying the sunshine and warm weather. Among the crowd were two young women who would become the most famous victims in what was becoming known as the Ted murders. Janice Ott, a 23-year-old probation caseworker, had gone to the park to sunbathe and enjoy the day off. She was approached by a handsome young man who introduced himself as Ted. He was wearing a white tennis outfit and had his left arm in a sling. He asked Janice if she would help him load a sailboat onto his car, explaining that his injury made it difficult to manage alone. Janice, being helpful and trusting, agreed to assist him. Several witnesses saw her walking away with the man toward the parking area. She was never seen alive again. Later that same day, Denise Naslund, a 19-year-old computer programmer, was at the park with her boyfriend and friends. She had gone to the restroom and was expected to return quickly, but she never came back. Her friends searched the park and called her name, but found no trace of her. Like Janice, Denise had long, dark hair and fit the profile of the other missing women. The Lake Sammamish disappearances were a turning point in the investigation because, for the first time, there were witnesses who had seen and spoken with the suspect. Multiple people remembered the polite, well-dressed young man with his arm in a sling who had introduced himself as Ted. They remembered his Volkswagen Beetle and his story about needing help with a sailboat. Most importantly, they remembered his face and his voice well enough to provide descriptions to police. The composite sketch that emerged from these witness interviews showed a conventionally attractive man in his 20s or 30s, with dark hair and even features. The description was circulated throughout the Pacific Northwest, and tips began pouring in from people who thought they knew someone who looked like the sketch. Among those tips was one that would prove crucial. Several people called to suggest that the man looked like Ted Bundy, a law student and political volunteer who had been active in Republican politics in the Seattle area. But when police initially looked into Ted Bundy, he seemed like an unlikely suspect. He was intelligent, articulate, and well regarded by his peers. He had no criminal record, was studying law at the University of Washington, and had worked on political campaigns including the 1968 gubernatorial campaign of Daniel J. Evans. He lived with his longtime girlfriend, Elizabeth Klopfer, and seemed to be a stable, ambitious young man with a bright future ahead of him. What investigators didn't know at the time was that Ted Bundy was already planning his next move. The attention from the Lake Sammamish case had made him nervous, and he was beginning to think about relocating to a new hunting ground where he could continue his killing spree without the pressure of an intensive investigation. In the fall of 1974, Ted Bundy made a decision that would extend his reign of terror far beyond the Pacific Northwest. He had been accepted to the University of Utah College of Law, and in August 1974, he moved to Salt Lake City to begin his studies. To his friends and family, it seemed like a natural progression, a bright young man pursuing his legal education at a respected institution. But for Bundy, the move represented something entirely different, a chance to start fresh in a new location where he could continue killing without the intensive scrutiny he was beginning to face in Washington. The move to Utah provided Bundy with several advantages. He was now in an environment where he was unknown, where his face wouldn't be recognized by potential victims or witnesses. The University of Utah campus provided him with a target-rich environment of young women who fit his preferred victim profile. Most importantly, law enforcement agencies in Utah were not yet aware of the pattern of disappearances that had plagued the Pacific Northwest, giving Bundy a head start before investigators could begin connecting the dots. Bundy's first confirmed victim in Utah was Nancy Wilcox, an 18-year-old cheerleader who disappeared on October 2, 1974, while walking from her home to a neighborhood store in Holiday, Utah. Nancy was a popular high school student who was looking forward to her senior year and planning for college. She had gone out to buy some gum and was expected back within minutes, but she never returned home. Her body was never found, and her disappearance remained a mystery for years. The pattern that had emerged in Washington continued in Utah with terrifying consistency. On October 18, 1974, Melissa Ann Smith, a 17-year-old high school student, disappeared after leaving a pizza parlor in Midvale, Utah. Her body was found 9 days later in the Wasatch Mountains, and the autopsy revealed she had been sexually assaulted and murdered. The condition of her body and the location where it was found suggested that her killer had kept her alive for several days before killing her. On October 31, 1974, Laura Ann M., an 17-year-old high school student, disappeared after leaving a cafe in Lehi, Utah. Her body was found nearly a month later in American Fork Canyon, and like Melissa Smith, she had been sexually assaulted and murdered. The similarities between the two cases were unmistakable. Both victims were young women with long, dark hair, both had been abducted from public places, and both had been kept alive for a period of time before being killed. But it was Bundy's next attempted victim who would provide the break that investigators had been desperately seeking. On November 8, 1974, Carol Duranch, an 18-year-old fashion merchandising student, was shopping at the Fashion Place Mall in Murray, Utah. She was approached by a man who identified himself as Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department. He told her that someone had attempted to break into her car and asked her to accompany him to the parking lot to file a report. Carol later described the man as well-dressed and polite, wearing a white shirt and tie. He had dark hair and spoke with authority, and his badge looked authentic. Trusting that he was indeed a police officer, Carol accompanied him to the parking lot. When they reached her car, however, there was no sign of any attempted break-in. The man then told her that they needed to go to the police station to file a report and view a lineup of potential suspects. Carol agreed to go with the man, and he led her to a tan Volkswagen Beetle. As they drove, Carol began to feel uneasy. The man's behavior seemed strange, and she noticed that the car's interior wasn't what she would expect from a police vehicle. Her suspicions were confirmed when the man suddenly pulled over and attempted to handcuff her. Carol fought back, managing to escape from the car and run to safety. She was able to provide police with a detailed description of her attacker and his vehicle. The Duranch case was significant because it was the first time Bundy had failed to successfully abduct a victim, and it provided law enforcement with crucial evidence. Carol's description of her attacker matched the composite sketch from the Lake Sammamish case, and her description of his vehicle, a tan Volkswagen Beetle, was consistent with witness reports from other cases. Later that same evening, just a few hours after the failed abduction of Carol Duranch, Deborah Kent, a 17-year-old high school student, disappeared from the parking lot of Viewmont High School in Bountiful, Utah. She had been attending a school play and had left briefly to pick up her brother, but she never returned. A key that would later be linked to the handcuffs found in Ted Bundy's possession was discovered in the school parking lot. The escalation of Bundy's crimes was becoming apparent to investigators across multiple states. In Colorado, similar disappearances were being reported. Karen Eileen Campbell, a 23-year-old nurse, disappeared from a ski resort in Snowmass, Colorado, on January 12, 1975. Her body was found a month later, and the circumstances of her death were consistent with the other murders being attributed to the same killer. Julie Cunningham, a 26-year-old ski instructor, disappeared while walking to a dinner date in Vail, Colorado, on March 15, 1975. Denise Lynn Oliverson, a 25-year-old riding her bicycle in Grand Junction, Colorado, vanished on April 6, 1975. Lynette Dawn Culver, a 12-year-old girl, disappeared from a junior high school in Pocatello, Idaho, on May 6, 1975. In each case, the victim was a young woman or girl who simply vanished without a trace. What made Bundy particularly dangerous during this period was his ability to adapt his methods based on what he learned from each attack. He was constantly refining his approach, learning from his mistakes, and developing new techniques for approaching and subduing his victims. He studied police procedures and investigation methods, using his knowledge to stay ahead of law enforcement efforts to catch him. Bundy's law school education was actually helping him become a better criminal. He understood evidence collection, witness testimony, and legal procedures. He knew how to avoid leaving physical evidence, how to dispose of bodies in ways that would hinder identification, and how to manipulate the legal system if he was ever caught. He was, in many ways, the perfect criminal, intelligent, organized, and utterly without conscience. In August 1975, police arrested Bundy for the first time after pulling him over in his Volkswagen and finding suspicious items, including handcuffs, rope, and a ski mask. The arrest occurred in the early morning hours of August 16, 1975, when Utah Highway Patrol Sergeant Bob Hayward spotted Bundy's tan Volkswagen Beetle in a residential neighborhood in Granger, Utah. What made the sighting suspicious wasn't just the late hour, but Bundy's behavior when he noticed the patrol car. Instead of continuing normally, Bundy immediately accelerated and attempted to flee, leading Sergeant Hayward on a brief chase through the suburban streets. When Hayward finally managed to pull Bundy over, the young man was polite and cooperative, but his explanations for his presence in the neighborhood were vague and inconsistent. He claimed he had been to see a movie at a drive-in theater, but couldn't remember the name of the film or provide a ticket stub. When Sergeant Hayward searched Bundy's vehicle, he discovered what he later described as a murder kit. The car contained handcuffs, rope, a ski mask, a crowbar, an ice pick, and other items that had no innocent explanation for being together in a vehicle at 2:30 in the morning. Bundy was arrested on suspicion of burglary, but investigators immediately began connecting him to the string of disappearances that had plagued the region. The arrest of Ted Bundy sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. Here was a suspect who finally fit the profile that had been developed over months of investigation, a white male in his 20s, driving a tan Volkswagen Beetle, with access to handcuffs and other restraints. More importantly, he had been arrested in an area and at a time that suggested he was actively hunting for victims. Detective Jerry Thompson of the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office was assigned to investigate Bundy's possible connection to the missing women cases. Thompson was a methodical investigator who had been working on the disappearances for months, and he immediately recognized the significance of Bundy's arrest. The items found in Bundy's car were consistent with the methods that the killer had been using, and Bundy's physical appearance matched the descriptions provided by witnesses. One of the most significant breaks in the case came when Carol Duranch was shown a photo lineup that included Bundy's picture. After studying the photos carefully, she positively identified Bundy as the man who had attempted to abduct her from the Fashion Place Mall. This identification provided investigators with their first solid connection between Bundy and an actual crime, rather than just suspicious circumstances. Bundy's trial began in February 1976. He waived his right to a jury trial and was found guilty of aggravated kidnapping on March 1, 1976. He was sentenced to a minimum of 1 to a maximum of 15 years in a Utah state prison. The conviction was a significant victory for law enforcement, but it was also just the beginning of a much larger legal battle. While Bundy was serving his sentence in Utah, investigators in Colorado were building their own case against him. They had linked him to the murder of Karen Campbell, the nurse who had disappeared from the Snowmass ski resort. The evidence against Bundy was largely circumstantial, but it was compelling. He had been in the area at the time of Campbell's disappearance, and witnesses had seen him at the resort. In October 1976, Bundy was charged with Campbell's murder and was scheduled to be extradited to Colorado to stand trial. But Bundy had other plans. He had been studying the legal system intensively, and he understood that the evidence against him in Colorado was stronger than it had been in Utah. A conviction for murder would likely result in a death sentence, something he was determined to avoid. In 1977, Theodore, or Ted, Robert Bundy, 1946 to 1989, escaped from custody while being transported to Colorado to stand trial for murder. The escape occurred on June 7, 1977, when Bundy was being taken to the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen for a preliminary hearing. During a recess, Bundy asked to visit the courthouse law library to research his case, a request that was granted because he was representing himself. The law library was on the second floor of the courthouse, and the windows were not barred because no one had ever considered that a prisoner would be desperate enough to jump from such a height. But Bundy was exactly that desperate. During his time in the library, he opened a window and leaped to the ground below, landing in the bushes and rolling to absorb the impact of the fall. Bundy's escape sent law enforcement agencies across the region into high alert. He was now a fugitive from justice, and everyone knew he was extremely dangerous. The FBI issued a federal warrant for his arrest, and his photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies across the country. For the first time, the public had a clear image of the man who had been terrorizing communities across multiple states. The escape also marked a turning point in Bundy's criminal career. He was no longer the careful, methodical killer who had managed to avoid detection for years. He was now a desperate fugitive, and desperation would make him sloppy. The mistakes he made during his time as a fugitive would ultimately lead to his final capture and conviction. Ted Bundy's first escape lasted only 6 days. On June 13, 1977, he was recaptured by law enforcement officers who had been conducting an intensive search of the Colorado mountains. Bundy had been hiding in the wilderness, surviving on stolen food and water, but he was unprepared for the harsh conditions and the coordinated search efforts. When he was found, he was exhausted, dehydrated, and suffering from exposure. The recapture was a relief to law enforcement, but it also highlighted just how dangerous Bundy had become. During his brief time as a fugitive, he had broken into several cabins and stolen food, clothing, and other supplies. More ominously, investigators found evidence that he had been planning additional crimes, including the potential abduction of more victims. The escape had given everyone a glimpse of what Bundy might be capable of if he ever managed to evade capture for an extended period. But Bundy's first escape had also taught him valuable lessons about prison security and the challenges of life as a fugitive. He began planning his next escape immediately upon his return to custody, and this time he would be much better prepared. He lost weight to make it easier to squeeze through small openings, he studied the layout of the jail in detail, and he began stockpiling supplies that he would need during his escape. On December 30, 1977, Bundy executed his second escape, and this one was far more successful than his first attempt. He had discovered that he could remove a light fixture in the ceiling of his cell and crawl through the space between the ceiling and the roof of the building. Over a period of several weeks, he had been loosening the fixture and enlarging the opening, working only at night when the sounds of his activities would be masked by the noise of other inmates. On the night of his escape, Bundy waited until the jail was quiet, then removed the light fixture and crawled through the ceiling space to an area above the jailer's apartment. He then dropped down into the apartment, which was unoccupied at the time, and simply walked out the front door of the building. By the time his absence was discovered during the morning head count, he had a significant head start on the law enforcement officers who would be pursuing him. This time, Bundy was much better prepared for life as a fugitive. He had lost nearly 35 pounds, making him look significantly different from his previous appearance. He had also grown a mustache and changed his hairstyle, further altering his appearance. Most importantly, he had carefully planned his escape route and had identified a destination where he could blend in and avoid detection. Bundy's destination was Florida, a state where he had never operated before and where law enforcement would not be specifically looking for him. He traveled by bus and car, paying cash for everything and using fake identification documents that he had obtained through various means. He was careful to avoid contact with law enforcement and to maintain a low profile wherever he went. In January 1978, Bundy arrived in Tallahassee, Florida, and rented a small apartment near the Florida State University campus. He used the name Chris Hagen and told people he was a graduate student. The FSU campus provided him with everything he needed: a target-rich environment of young women, easy access to multiple escape routes, and the anonymity that comes with being part of a large university community. For several weeks, Bundy managed to maintain his cover identity while planning his next series of attacks. He survived by stealing credit cards and checkbooks, shoplifting food and clothing, and burglarizing homes and vehicles. He was careful to avoid any contact with law enforcement, and he seemed to be successfully evading capture. But the stress of life as a fugitive was taking its toll on Bundy's psychological state. He was becoming increasingly paranoid and impulsive, and the careful planning that had characterized his earlier crimes was beginning to break down. The discipline that had allowed him to evade capture for so long was crumbling under the pressure of constant vigilance and the knowledge that he was one mistake away from being caught. In January 1978, evil visited Tallahassee in the form of a psychopathic stalker who was later identified as one of the most vicious serial killers in modern history. On January 15, 1978, Bundy's control finally snapped completely. In the early morning hours, he entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University through an unlocked door and went on a rampage that would become one of the most infamous crimes in American history. In less than 15 minutes, Bundy attacked 4 young women in their beds. Lisa Levy, a 20-year-old fashion merchandising student, was sexually assaulted and beaten to death with a piece of firewood. Margaret Bowman, a 21-year-old art student, was strangled with a nylon stocking and beaten so severely that her skull was fractured. Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner were both severely beaten but survived their attacks, though both suffered significant injuries including broken bones and lacerations. The Chi Omega attacks were different from Bundy's previous crimes in several important ways. They were much more violent and frenzied, reflecting his deteriorating mental state. They occurred in a location where discovery was inevitable, suggesting that he was no longer thinking clearly about escape and evasion. Most importantly, they were committed with a recklessness that would ultimately lead to his capture. Less than an hour after the Chi Omega attacks, Bundy struck again. He broke into an apartment just a few blocks away and attacked Cheryl Thomas, a 21-year-old Florida State dance student. Thomas was severely beaten and sexually assaulted, but she survived the attack. The proximity in time and location of the two attacks suggested that the perpetrator was either extremely bold or completely out of control. The Chi Omega murders sent shockwaves through Tallahassee and the Florida State University community. The brutal nature of the attacks and the fact that they had occurred in what should have been the safety of a sorority house created a level of fear and panic that the city had never experienced. Law enforcement agencies from across the state were called in to assist with the investigation, and the FBI provided additional resources and expertise. The investigation moved quickly because Bundy had made several crucial mistakes during his rampage. He had left behind physical evidence at both crime scenes, including bite marks on Lisa Levy's body that would later prove crucial to his conviction. He had also been seen by witnesses in the area around the time of the attacks, and his description was consistent with the composite sketches that had been circulated for years. But even as investigators were building their case, Bundy was planning his next move. He knew that his attacks had been too reckless, too visible, and that law enforcement would be intensifying their search efforts. He decided to leave Tallahassee and head to a new location where he could lay low until the heat died down. On February 9, 1978, Bundy committed what would be his final murder. 12-year-old Kimberly Leach was abducted from her junior high school in Lake City, Florida, while she was walking to her homeroom class. Kimberly was a popular student who had gone back to her homeroom to retrieve her purse, but she never returned to her physical education class. Her body was found 8 weeks later in a remote area of Suwannee River State Park. The abduction and murder of Kimberly Leach represented a new low in Bundy's criminal career. She was younger than any of his previous victims, and her abduction from a school during daylight hours showed a level of recklessness that suggested he was completely losing control. The case also generated enormous media attention and public outrage, intensifying the pressure on law enforcement to capture him. Bundy's final capture came on February 15, 1978, just 6 days after Kimberly Leach's disappearance. He was driving a stolen orange Volkswagen Beetle through Pensacola, Florida, when he was stopped by police officer David Lee for a routine traffic violation. Lee had no idea who he was stopping, but he became suspicious when Bundy's behavior seemed nervous and evasive. When Officer Lee ran the license plate number, he discovered that the vehicle had been reported stolen. He attempted to arrest Bundy, but the fugitive tried to fight and escape. The struggle was brief, and Bundy was quickly subdued and taken into custody. When he was searched, investigators found multiple fake identification documents and other evidence that suggested he was involved in serious criminal activity. Initially, Bundy was arrested only for the car theft, but investigators quickly began connecting him to the string of murders that had occurred across multiple states. His fingerprints were taken and compared to evidence from various crime scenes, and witnesses were shown his photograph to see if they could identify him as the suspect in various cases. The identification process was remarkably successful. Carol Duranch, who had survived Bundy's attempted abduction in Utah years earlier, was flown to Florida and positively identified him as her attacker. Witnesses from the Lake Sammamish case in Washington also identified him as the man they had seen with the missing women. Most importantly, forensic experts were able to match bite marks found on Lisa Levy's body to dental impressions taken from Bundy. The capture of Ted Bundy marked the end of one of the most intensive manhunts in American history. For nearly 4 years, he had evaded capture while committing crimes across multiple states, but his increasingly reckless behavior had finally caught up with him. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and investigators were confident that they finally had enough to ensure his conviction and execution. Ted Bundy's legal proceedings would become almost as famous as his crimes themselves. Bundy's good looks, charm and intelligence made him something of a celebrity during his trial. He fought for his life but, in July 1979, was convicted for the murders of Bowman and Levy and given the death penalty twice. The trial was one of the first to be televised nationally, and Bundy's courtroom performance captivated audiences across the country. Bundy chose to represent himself during much of his trial, a decision that allowed him to cross-examine witnesses and present arguments directly to the jury. He was articulate, well-prepared, and seemed to genuinely enjoy the attention and drama of the courtroom proceedings. To many observers, he appeared more like a skilled attorney than an accused serial killer, and his performance reinforced the public's fascination with his case. But despite his charisma and legal skills, the evidence against Bundy was overwhelming. The prosecution presented forensic evidence linking him to the Chi Omega murders, including the crucial bite mark evidence that matched his dental impressions. They also presented testimony from survivors of his attacks, witnesses who had seen him at various crime scenes, and evidence of his pattern of behavior across multiple states. The bite mark evidence was particularly damaging because it provided a direct physical link between Bundy and Lisa Levy's murder. Forensic odontologist Dr. Richard Sovereign testified that the bite marks on Levy's body matched Bundy's teeth with a high degree of certainty, and that the unusual characteristics of Bundy's dental structure made it extremely unlikely that anyone else could have made those marks. Bundy's defense strategy focused on challenging the reliability of the evidence and suggesting that he was being framed for crimes he didn't commit. He argued that the bite mark evidence was unreliable, that witness identifications were influenced by media coverage, and that investigators had focused on him to the exclusion of other possible suspects. However, the sheer volume of evidence against him made this strategy largely ineffective. The jury deliberated for less than 7 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Bundy was convicted of the murders of Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman, as well as the attempted murders of Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner. The penalty phase of the trial was equally brief, with the jury recommending death sentences for both murders. Bundy was also tried separately for the murder of Kimberly Leach, the 12-year-old girl he had abducted from her school in Lake City. This trial was held in Orlando, Florida, and once again Bundy chose to represent himself. The evidence in this case was also strong, including fibers from Bundy's clothing found on Kimberly's body and witness testimony placing him in the area at the time of her disappearance. The Leach trial resulted in another death sentence, bringing Bundy's total to 3 death penalties. He spent 9 years on death row appealing his sentence, using every legal maneuver available to delay his execution. During this time, he became something of a celebrity, giving interviews to journalists and authors, and maintaining correspondence with people around the world who were fascinated by his case. As his execution date approached, Bundy finally began to cooperate with investigators who were still trying to solve cold cases that might be connected to his crimes. He had maintained his innocence for years, but the reality of his impending execution finally motivated him to provide information about his crimes. What emerged from these final interviews was a picture of a killer whose crimes were even more extensive than anyone had imagined. In his final confessions, Bundy admitted to 28 murders across multiple states, though investigators believe the actual number may have been much higher. He provided details about crimes that had never been solved, helped families find closure about missing loved ones, and gave investigators insights into his methods and motivations. Some of his confessions were detailed and verifiable, while others were vague or contradictory, leading investigators to question whether he was telling the complete truth even in his final days. The confessions revealed the true scope of Bundy's crimes and confirmed what investigators had long suspected, that he had been one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. His victims ranged in age from 12-year-old Kimberly Leach to women in their mid-20s, spanning a geographic area from Washington state to Florida, and a timeline stretching from 1974 to 1978. Bundy's final interviews with investigators revealed disturbing details about his methodology and psychology. He described how he would often return to the sites where he had left his victims' bodies, sometimes for months after their deaths. He admitted to acts of necrophilia and explained how he had kept severed heads as trophies in his apartment. These confessions painted a picture of a killer whose depravity went far beyond what most people could comprehend. Perhaps most chilling was Bundy's matter-of-fact demeanor during these confessions. He spoke about his crimes with the detached professionalism of someone discussing a business transaction, showing no genuine remorse or emotion for the suffering he had caused. When pressed about his motivations, he described his killings as the result of an addiction, a compulsion that had grown stronger over time until it completely consumed his life. Bundy also provided insights into how he had selected his victims. He confirmed what investigators had long suspected, that he had targeted women who resembled his first serious girlfriend, who had broken up with him in the early 1970s. The long, dark hair parted in the middle that characterized most of his victims was not a coincidence, but a deliberate choice that reflected his desire for revenge against women who reminded him of his personal rejection. As Bundy's execution approached, psychologists, criminologists, and law enforcement professionals tried to understand what had created such a monster. His case became a watershed moment in the study of serial killers, providing insights that would influence criminal profiling and investigation techniques for decades to come. Dr. Dorothy Lewis, a psychiatrist who interviewed Bundy extensively, found evidence of significant head injuries during his childhood, as well as a family history of mental illness and violence. However, she also noted that millions of people experience similar trauma without becoming serial killers, suggesting that Bundy's crimes resulted from a complex interaction of biological, psychological, and social factors. What made Bundy particularly dangerous was his ability to compartmentalize his behavior. During the day, he could function as a charming law student, political volunteer, and seemingly caring boyfriend. At night, he transformed into a predator who stalked, tortured, and killed innocent women. This duality allowed him to evade suspicion for years and highlighted how traditional assumptions about what killers look like could be dangerously misleading. Bundy's case also revealed the limitations of law enforcement cooperation in the 1970s. His crimes spanned multiple states and jurisdictions, but communication between agencies was limited. Information that might have connected the dots earlier was often not shared, allowing Bundy to continue killing while investigators in different states worked in isolation. His case helped drive improvements in interagency cooperation and the development of databases that could track patterns across jurisdictional boundaries. The media attention surrounding Bundy's case also raised disturbing questions about society's fascination with charismatic killers. Bundy received thousands of letters from admirers during his time on death row, many from women who seemed attracted to his notoriety. He was even married while in prison, to Carol and Boone, who had worked with him years earlier and continued to believe in his innocence despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. On January 24, 1989, after nearly a decade on death row and countless appeals, Ted Bundy's legal options were finally exhausted. The state of Florida prepared to carry out the death sentence that had been imposed for his crimes. As his execution approached, Bundy made increasingly desperate attempts to delay the inevitable, offering to provide information about additional unsolved cases in exchange for more time. In his final days, Bundy granted a series of interviews to evangelical minister and psychologist Dr. James Dobson. In these conversations, Bundy attempted to blame his crimes on his consumption of violent pornography, claiming that it had desensitized him to violence and fueled his fantasies. However, many experts viewed this as a final manipulation, an attempt to shift responsibility away from his own choices and onto external factors. On the morning of January 24, 1989, Theodore Robert Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. He was 42 years old. Outside the prison, crowds had gathered to witness this moment of justice, some holding signs celebrating the execution of one of America's most notorious killers. The execution was carried out at 7:16 a.m., and Bundy was pronounced dead shortly thereafter. The families of Bundy's victims had waited years for this moment. For some, his execution provided a sense of closure and justice. For others, no punishment could truly balance the scales for the loss of their loved ones. Eleanor Rose, the mother of Denise Naslund, one of the Lake Sammamish victims, said simply, "He's where he belongs now." Ted Bundy's death marked the end of one of the most significant criminal cases in American history, but his impact on law enforcement, psychology, and popular culture continues to this day. His case helped revolutionize criminal profiling, leading to better understanding of how serial killers operate and how they can be caught more quickly. The investigation of Bundy's crimes led to improvements in communication between law enforcement agencies and the development of databases that could track patterns across jurisdictional boundaries. The lessons learned from his case helped investigators solve other serial killer cases and prevent additional victims from being claimed by similar predators. Bundy's case also highlighted the importance of listening to survivors and witnesses. Carol Durancha's survival and her ability to identify her attacker were crucial to his eventual capture and conviction. Her courage in testifying against him helped ensure that justice was served, and her experience became a model for how survivors of violent crimes could contribute to the investigation and prosecution of their attackers. The families of Bundy's victims showed remarkable strength and dignity throughout the long legal process. They became advocates for victims' rights and helped push for changes in the legal system that would give victims' families a greater voice in criminal proceedings. Their perseverance in the face of unimaginable loss serves as an inspiration to others who have been touched by violent crime. As we conclude our first story of Ted Bundy's crimes and the justice that finally caught up with him, it's important to remember that this is ultimately not a story about him, but about the innocent lives he took and the families and communities he devastated. Linda Ann Healy was a psychology student who wanted to help people. Donna Gail Manson was studying to be a teacher. Susan Elaine Rancourt was passionate about biology and dreamed of becoming a researcher. Each of Bundy's victims was a unique individual with hopes, dreams, and people who loved them. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and students who had their entire lives ahead of them. Their stories remind us that behind every crime statistic is a real person whose life had value and meaning. While Ted Bundy's name became infamous, it's the names and memories of his victims that deserve to be preserved and honored. They represent the true human cost of his crimes and the reason why justice was so important. In remembering their stories, we honor their memory and reaffirm our commitment to protecting the innocent from those who would do them harm. Their lives mattered, their losses were profound, and their memory serves as a reminder of our responsibility to each other and to the pursuit of justice. Justice was served on January 24, 1989, but the memory of Ted Bundy's victims lives on, a testament to lives cut short but not forgotten. I honestly want to use this opportunity to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Please, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 2. This particular story is one of patience, persistence, and the remarkable power of modern science to illuminate truths that have been hidden in darkness for decades. This is the story of Rebecca Martinez, a vibrant 19-year-old college student whose life was cut short on a winter night in Denver, Colorado, in 1987. For 36 years, Rebecca's killer walked free while her family carried the weight of unanswered questions. But in 2023, cutting-edge DNA technology and the dedication of a new generation of investigators finally brought the truth to light. This is a story of how justice, though delayed, can still be served. As you settle in tonight, let me take you through this remarkable case, from a tragic night in the 1980s to a courtroom in 2023, where science and determination converged to give a family the closure they had waited nearly 4 decades to receive. Rebecca Elena Martinez was born on a warm July day in 1967 in the mile-high city of Denver, Colorado. She was the middle child of 3, sandwiched between her protective older brother Miguel and her spirited younger sister Sofia. Her parents, Eduardo and Carmen Martinez, had immigrated from Mexico in the early 1960s, building a life centered around family, hard work, and the American dream. Rebecca grew up in the Highland neighborhood, a tight-knit community where everyone knew each other's business and children played freely in the streets until the streetlights came on. The Martinez family lived in a modest 2-story house on Lowell Boulevard, with Eduardo working as a mechanic at a local garage and Carmen taking in sewing to help make ends meet. From an early age, Rebecca displayed an insatiable curiosity about the world around her. She was the child who asked, why, about everything. Why did flowers bloom in spring? Why did her father's hands always smell like motor oil? Why did some people speak Spanish and others English? Her teachers at Holy Family High School recognized her potential early, encouraging her to pursue higher education despite the financial challenges her family faced. Rebecca was studious but not bookish, social but not frivolous. She had a laugh that could fill a room and a way of making everyone feel included in whatever she was doing. Her best friend since childhood, Maria Gonzalez, would later tell investigators that Rebecca had a gift for seeing the good in people, sometimes to a fault. In the fall of 1986, Rebecca became the first person in her family to attend college when she enrolled at the University of Colorado Denver, majoring in elementary education. She wanted to teach, she told her parents, because she believed every child deserved someone who would help them reach their potential. She worked part-time at a local diner to help pay for books and expenses, often studying between serving tables and cleaning up after the dinner rush. Rebecca lived at home to save money, taking the bus to campus each day. She was a creature of habit: Tuesday and Thursday evening classes, weekend shifts at the diner, Sunday dinners with the extended family that often lasted well into the evening. She had been dating a fellow student, Carlos Herrera, for about 8 months, and her family was beginning to wonder if wedding bells might be in their future. But Rebecca was in no hurry. At 19, she felt like she had all the time in the world to figure out love, career, and everything else life might offer. She was focused on her studies, determined to graduate with honors and become the teacher she dreamed of being. She often talked about the classroom she would have someday, the bulletin board she would create, the students whose lives she would touch. The Martinez family was close-knit in the way that many immigrant families are, protective, supportive, and bound together by shared experiences and dreams. Rebecca was the family translator, the one who helped her parents navigate official documents and school meetings for her younger sister. She was the bridge between their past in Mexico and their future in America. In late 1987, Rebecca was in her second year of college and hitting her stride. Her grades were excellent, she had been accepted into the education program, and she was beginning to think seriously about student teaching the following year. She had her whole life planned out in the careful, methodical way that organized people do: graduate by 22, teach for a few years, marry Carlos, have children, and live the American dream her parents had sacrificed so much to provide. December 3, 1987, dawned gray and cold in Denver, with the kind of bitter wind that cuts through even the heaviest winter coats. Rebecca had a Thursday evening class, educational psychology, scheduled for 7 p.m. in the education building on the University of Colorado Denver campus. It was a class she particularly enjoyed, led by Professor Janet Walsh, who had become something of a mentor to Rebecca. Rebecca's routine that Thursday was identical to every other Thursday that semester. She worked the lunch shift at Rosita's Diner, where she was known for her warm smile and her ability to remember every regular customer's usual order. Her manager, Mrs. Patterson, later told police that Rebecca seemed perfectly normal that day, cheerful, efficient, and looking forward to her evening class. Rebecca left the diner at 4:30 p.m., giving her time to go home, eat dinner with her family, and review her notes before catching the 6:15 p.m. bus to campus. Carmen Martinez prepared Rebecca's favorite meal that evening, chicken enchiladas with her homemade verde sauce, not knowing it would be the last dinner they would share. The conversation around the Martinez dinner table that night centered on Christmas plans and Sophia's upcoming high school graduation. Rebecca was excited about both. She had been saving money to buy her parents a new television for Christmas, and she was already planning Sophia's graduation party. Eduardo teased Rebecca about spending too much time with her nose in books, while Carmen worried aloud about Rebecca taking the bus after dark. "Mija, maybe Carlos could pick you up after class," Carmen suggested, as she had many times before. "Mama, I'm fine," Rebecca replied, kissing her mother's cheek. "The bus stop is right by the building, and there are always other students around. Stop worrying." Rebecca caught the 6:15 p.m. bus as usual, carrying her heavy backpack filled with textbooks and the thermos of coffee her mother always prepared for her evening classes. Security cameras at the university, though primitive by today's standards, captured her entering the education building at 6:48 p.m. She was wearing her favorite winter coat, a burgundy wool pea coat that had been a Christmas gift from her parents the year before. The educational psychology class proceeded normally. Professor Walsh was discussing child development theories, and Rebecca, as usual, participated actively in the discussion. Her classmates would later remember her asking thoughtful questions about how socioeconomic factors influenced learning outcomes, a topic close to her heart given her own family's experience. Class ended at 8:45 p.m. Rebecca gathered her books, chatted briefly with two classmates about an upcoming assignment, and left the building at approximately 9:10 p.m. The security camera captured her final image, walking through the lobby, adjusting her backpack, checking her watch. She appeared calm, unhurried, focused on getting to her bus stop. The bus that would have taken Rebecca home arrived at 9:25 p.m. The driver, Martin Rodriguez, had driven that route for 12 years and knew Rebecca as a regular passenger. When she didn't board that night, he assumed she had caught a ride with someone else. It wouldn't have been unusual for a college student to get a ride home rather than wait in the cold. But Rebecca never made it to the bus stop. At 11:30 p.m., Carmen Martinez called the police. Rebecca always called when she would be late, without exception. The family had waited, thinking perhaps she had stopped at the library or gone for coffee with classmates. But as the hours passed with no word, their concern turned to panic. The initial police response was frustratingly routine. Rebecca was 19, an adult, and had been missing for less than 4 hours. The desk sergeant suggested she might have gone to a friend's house or decided to stay on campus. Eduardo Martinez's broken English and visible distress seemed to convince the officer that this was likely just a cultural misunderstanding about teenage independence. But Detective Frank Morales, a 15-year veteran of the Denver Police Department, understood the Martinez family's concern. He had grown up in a similar household and knew that a girl like Rebecca didn't just disappear without calling home. He began making inquiries that very night, contacting the university security and checking with local hospitals. By dawn on December 4th, it was clear that something terrible had happened to Rebecca Martinez. Her professor confirmed she had attended class and left at the usual time. Campus security found no sign of her anywhere on university grounds. Most ominously, her thermos was found in a snowbank near the education building, its contents still warm, suggesting she had dropped it, or it had been dropped, shortly after she left class. The search for Rebecca Martinez began in earnest that Friday morning, but it would be tragically brief. At 2:15 p.m., her body was discovered by a maintenance worker in Riverside Cemetery, about 2 miles from the university campus. Rebecca had been sexually assaulted and murdered. Her life brutally ended just hours after she had been discussing child development theories and planning her future as a teacher. Detective Frank Morales stood over Rebecca Martinez's body in Riverside Cemetery that cold December afternoon, and something inside him hardened into a resolve that would define the next phase of his career. Rebecca lay in a secluded area of the cemetery, partially covered by snow that had fallen during the night. The scene told a story of struggle, violence, and a young life snuffed out with cruel randomness. The initial crime scene investigation, conducted by the standards of 1987, was thorough but limited by the technology available at the time. Photographs were taken with film cameras, evidence was collected in paper bags, and witness statements were recorded by hand on lined notebooks. The forensic techniques that would later solve this case didn't yet exist. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the county medical examiner, conducted the autopsy on December 5. Her findings painted a picture of Rebecca's final hours that haunted everyone involved in the case. Rebecca had died from manual strangulation, but she had fought her attacker fiercely. DNA evidence was collected, but genetic analysis was still in its infancy. The technology to create a usable profile from the evidence found on Rebecca's body wouldn't be developed for several more years. Detective Morales threw himself into the investigation with a dedication that bordered on obsession. He interviewed everyone who had been on the university campus that night: students, faculty, security guards, maintenance workers, and bus drivers. He canvassed the neighborhood between the university and Riverside Cemetery, knocking on doors and asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. The investigation revealed several promising leads that ultimately led nowhere. A groundskeeper at the cemetery reported seeing a man in a dark coat near the area where Rebecca's body was found, but his description was too vague to be useful. A student thought she had seen Rebecca talking to someone in the parking lot after class, but she couldn't provide any details about the person Rebecca had been speaking with. Carlos Herrera, Rebecca's boyfriend, was naturally scrutinized as a potential suspect. He had been at work at a grocery store until 11 p.m. that night, with dozens of witnesses and time clock records to verify his alibi. More importantly, Detective Morales's instincts told him that Carlos's grief and shock were genuine. The young man was devastated by Rebecca's death and cooperated fully with the investigation. The physical evidence collected at the scene included shoe impressions in the mud near Rebecca's body, tire tracks that may or may not have been connected to the crime, and most importantly, biological evidence that would prove crucial decades later. But in 1987, DNA analysis was not yet available to law enforcement agencies like the Denver Police Department. Detective Morales worked the case aggressively for the first 6 months, following up on tips, interviewing suspects in similar crimes, and building a comprehensive file that would eventually fill 3 thick binders. He consulted with the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, who provided a profile of the likely perpetrator, a white male between 20 and 35, probably local to the Denver area, possibly with a history of sexual offenses. The case received significant media attention in Denver, partly because Rebecca was a sympathetic victim, a hard-working college student from a loving family, and partly because the random nature of the crime frightened other parents and students. Rewards were offered, composite sketches were distributed, and the story was featured on local television programs. But as 1988 turned into 1989, the leads dried up. New cases demanded Detective Morales's attention, though he never truly let go of Rebecca's case. He would periodically review the file, re-interview witnesses, and follow up on tips that continued to trickle in. Rebecca's case became his white whale, the one that got away, the case that would define his career. Eduardo Martinez visited Detective Morales every month for the first 2 years after Rebecca's murder, asking for updates and pleading for continued investigation. The meetings were heartbreaking for both men, Eduardo desperate for answers, Detective Morales frustrated by his inability to provide them. Eventually, the monthly visits became quarterly, then yearly, then stopped altogether, though the pain never diminished. Carmen Martinez channeled her grief differently. She became involved with victim advocacy groups, helping other families navigate the criminal justice system and cope with their losses. She never stopped hoping that someday, someone would be held accountable for her daughter's death, but as the years passed, that hope became a quiet ember rather than a burning flame. The original investigation officially remained open, but by 1990, Rebecca's case had joined the growing pile of cold cases that plague every police department. Detective Morales retired in 2003, passing the case file to younger detectives who would periodically review it but had their own active cases to pursue. For 23 years, Rebecca's case gathered dust in the Denver Police Department's cold case files. Technology advanced, investigative techniques improved, and DNA analysis became standard practice, but Rebecca's case remained unsolved. Her family learned to live with the uncertainty, though it never truly left them. They held annual memorial services, maintained a scholarship in her name at the University of Colorado Denver, and kept her memory alive in the hope that someday, justice would finally be served. The years between 1990 and 2020 were a long, slow journey through grief for the Martinez family. Eduardo developed heart problems that his doctors attributed partly to stress, while Carmen threw herself into community work, becoming a respected advocate for victims' families throughout the Denver metro area. Miguel, Rebecca's older brother, became a police officer himself, partly inspired by Detective Morales's dedication to his sister's case. Sophia, Rebecca's younger sister, graduated from high school and eventually college, becoming a social worker. She often wondered what conversations she might have had with Rebecca, what advice her big sister might have given her during difficult times. The family kept Rebecca's room exactly as she had left it for 5 years before finally converting it into a home office, but they never stopped talking about her as if she might walk through the door at any moment. During this period, DNA technology was revolutionizing criminal investigations across the country. What had been impossible in 1987 became routine by the late 1990s. Cold cases from the 1970s and 1980s were being solved with increasing frequency as DNA profiles were developed from evidence that had been sitting in evidence rooms for decades. In 2003, Detective Sarah Chen of the Denver Police Department's Cold Case Unit reviewed Rebecca's file as part of a systematic examination of unsolved sexual homicides. Detective Chen submitted the biological evidence from Rebecca's case to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation's lab for DNA analysis. A profile was successfully developed, but when it was run through CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, there were no matches. This was both encouraging and frustrating. Encouraging because it meant there was a usable DNA profile that could potentially identify Rebecca's killer. Frustrating because without a match in the database, the profile was just a string of genetic markers with no name attached. Detective Chen tried several approaches over the following years. She had the DNA profile compared to samples from known sex offenders in Colorado and surrounding states. She followed up on tips that continued to come in sporadically, using the DNA profile to rule out suspects. She even explored the possibility that Rebecca's killer might have been someone passing through Denver, a trucker, traveling salesman, or drifter, which would explain why the profile wasn't in the system. The Martinez family met with Detective Chen annually, usually around the anniversary of Rebecca's death. These meetings became a ritual of sorts. The family would bring flowers for Rebecca's grave, then stop by the police station to check on the case. Detective Chen always treated them with respect and compassion, but year after year, she had to deliver the same message: the case remained unsolved, but they hadn't given up. In 2018, everything changed when Detective Chen attended a conference on forensic genealogy. She learned about a new technique that was revolutionizing cold case investigations, using public DNA databases to identify suspects through their family members. Cases that had been cold for decades were suddenly being solved in a matter of weeks or months. The technique, called forensic genetic genealogy, worked by uploading crime scene DNA profiles to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch, where millions of people had uploaded their DNA data from companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA. By identifying distant relatives of the perpetrator, skilled genealogists could build family trees and eventually narrow down the list of potential suspects to a manageable number. Detective Chen returned to Denver excited about the possibilities but faced with budgetary constraints. Forensic genealogy investigations were expensive and time-consuming, requiring specialized expertise that the Denver Police Department didn't have in-house. She would need to make a compelling case to her supervisors to justify the expense. Rebecca's case was an ideal candidate for forensic genealogy. The DNA profile was strong and complete, the case was high-profile enough to justify the expense, and the Martinez family remained actively engaged in seeking justice. In late 2022, Detective Chen finally received approval to move forward with a forensic genealogy investigation. In January 2023, Detective Sarah Chen contacted Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company that specializes in forensic genetic genealogy. The company had gained national attention for solving dozens of cold cases, including some that were decades old. Dr. Janet Williams, a forensic genealogist with Parabon, agreed to take on Rebecca's case. The process began with uploading Rebecca's killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database that allows law enforcement searches. Within hours, the system had identified several potential genetic matches, distant relatives who shared DNA segments with the unknown perpetrator. Dr. Williams began the painstaking process of building family trees for each of the genetic matches. Using public records, obituaries, census data, and other genealogical resources, she started mapping out the relationships between the people who had shared their DNA data and their ancestors. The goal was to find a common ancestor who could be the grandparent or great-grandparent of Rebecca's killer. The work was tedious and required specialized skills in both genetics and genealogy. Dr. Williams had to understand inheritance patterns, population genetics, and how DNA is passed down through generations. She also had to be a skilled researcher, able to navigate historical records and piece together family relationships from fragmentary information. After 2 weeks of intensive research, Dr. Williams had identified a promising family tree. The genetic matches all pointed to a family that had settled in Colorado in the early 1900s. The common ancestors were Thomas and Mary Patterson, who had homesteaded near what is now Lakewood, Colorado, in 1903. From this starting point, Dr. Williams began building out the family tree to identify all of Thomas and Mary Patterson's descendants who were living in the Denver area in 1987. The list was extensive. The Patterson family had been prolific, and their descendants were scattered throughout Colorado and the surrounding states. Dr. Williams narrowed the list by focusing on males who would have been between 18 and 40 years old in 1987, the age range suggested by the original FBI profile. She also looked for individuals who had some connection to the University of Colorado Denver area or who had a history of criminal behavior. One name stood out: Robert James Patterson, age 24 in 1987, who had been living in an apartment just 3 miles from the university campus. Robert was the great-great-grandson of Thomas and Mary Patterson, and according to public records, he had worked as a maintenance contractor for various businesses in the Denver area. Detective Chen began investigating Robert Patterson's background. What she found was both promising and frustrating. Robert had indeed lived in Denver in 1987, working for a company that provided maintenance services to office buildings and schools. He had no prior arrests for serious crimes, but there were several minor infractions: trespassing, disorderly conduct, and a domestic violence complaint that was later dropped. More significantly, Robert Patterson had died in 2019 from complications related to diabetes. He had been 56 years old and had lived a relatively quiet life in the decades following Rebecca's murder. He had married, divorced, worked various jobs, and essentially disappeared into the anonymity of suburban American life. The fact that Patterson was deceased complicated the investigation but didn't end it. Detective Chen needed to confirm that he was indeed Rebecca's killer before closing the case. This would require obtaining a DNA sample from Patterson for direct comparison with the crime scene evidence. Detective Chen contacted Patterson's adult daughter, Jennifer, who was living in Aurora, Colorado. The conversation was delicate. Chen needed to explain why she was interested in Jennifer's deceased father without revealing too much about the investigation. Jennifer Patterson was initially suspicious and confused, but when Detective Chen explained that they were trying to solve a decades-old murder case, Jennifer agreed to cooperate. Jennifer provided a DNA sample through a simple cheek swab, and it was sent to the lab for analysis. The results would take several weeks to process, but Detective Chen was optimistic. The genealogy research had been thorough, and Robert Patterson fit the profile of Rebecca's killer in multiple ways. While waiting for the DNA results, Detective Chen continued investigating Robert Patterson's life. She interviewed former co-workers, neighbors, and family members, building a picture of a man who had struggled with alcohol and had a history of inappropriate behavior toward women. Several people remembered him as having a temper, particularly when he had been drinking. Most intriguingly, Detective Chen discovered that Patterson's maintenance company had occasionally done work at the University of Colorado Denver campus. While there was no record of him being there on December 3, 1987, it was possible that he had been familiar with the campus layout and the areas where students typically waited for buses. On March 15, 2023, Detective Sarah Chen received the phone call she had been waiting for. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation's lab confirmed that Robert James Patterson's DNA was a match to the genetic material found at Rebecca Martinez's crime scene. After 36 years, Rebecca's killer had finally been identified. The confirmation brought a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that the case was finally solved, but frustration that Patterson had died 4 years earlier, taking his secrets with him to the grave. There would be no trial, no opportunity for the Martinez family to confront their daughter's killer, no chance for Patterson to explain his actions or express remorse. Detective Chen immediately contacted the Martinez family to share the news. The phone call to Carmen Martinez was one of the most difficult conversations of Chen's career. Carmen, now 78 years old, listened in silence as Chen explained that they had identified Rebecca's killer but that he was already dead. "How did he die?" Carmen asked quietly. "Natural causes, Mrs. Martinez. Diabetes complications. He was 56. There was a long pause before Carmen spoke again. "Did he have a family?" "Yes, ma'am. A daughter. She helped us confirm the match." Carmen Martinez's reaction surprised Detective Chen. Instead of anger or frustration, she expressed a kind of resigned sadness. "I used to imagine what I would say to him," Carmen said. "I wanted to ask him why. Why Rebecca? Why our family? But now I guess I'll never know." The official press conference was held on March 22, 2023, in the Denver Police Department's media room. Chief of Police Patricia Williams announced that the Rebecca Martinez homicide case had been solved through forensic genetic genealogy. The Martinez family was there, dignified in their grief and gratitude. Eduardo Martinez, now 82 and using a walker, read a prepared statement. "Our daughter Rebecca was taken from us 36 years ago," he said, his voice steady despite his age. "We never stopped believing that someday, we would have answers. Today, we finally do. While we wish Robert Patterson was still alive to face justice, we are grateful to finally know the truth." The media coverage was extensive, focusing both on the resolution of Rebecca's case and on the broader implications of forensic genetic genealogy for solving cold cases. Detective Chen was interviewed by several news outlets, explaining how the technology worked and why it had taken so long to solve Rebecca's case. The investigation into Robert Patterson's life continued even after his identification as Rebecca's killer. Detective Chen wanted to determine if Patterson might have been responsible for other crimes. She compared his DNA profile to unsolved cases in Colorado and surrounding states, looking for additional matches. The search revealed no additional victims, but it did uncover a pattern of behavior that was consistent with someone who might escalate to murder. Patterson had been arrested twice in the 1990s for following women, though the charges were dropped both times. Neighbors recalled him as someone who made women uncomfortable, though no one had suspected he was capable of murder. Jennifer Patterson, Robert's daughter, agreed to meet with Detective Chen after the public announcement. The meeting was emotional and difficult. Jennifer had been 7 years old when Rebecca was murdered, and she had no memory of her father's behavior during that time period. She did, however, remember her parents' marriage deteriorating during the late 1980s, with frequent arguments and her father's increasing drinking. "I always knew there was something wrong with him," Jennifer told Detective Chen. "He was angry a lot, especially when he drank. But I never imagined. I never thought he could do something like this." Jennifer provided additional information about her father's life that helped Detective Chen understand how he might have encountered Rebecca. Patterson had worked evening shifts in 1987, often finishing work around the time Rebecca's class ended. He was familiar with the university area and would have known about the bus routes and schedules. The Martinez family's journey through 36 years of uncertainty had changed them all in profound ways. Eduardo, who had been a strong, optimistic man in 1987, became increasingly withdrawn after Rebecca's death. His health declined steadily, and doctors attributed his heart problems partly to the chronic stress of losing his daughter and never knowing why. Carmen channeled her grief into helping others, becoming a fixture in Denver's victim advocacy community. She had helped dozens of families navigate the criminal justice system, offering support and guidance based on her own painful experience. Her work gave her a sense of purpose during the darkest years, though it never filled the hole left by Rebecca's absence. Miguel, Rebecca's older brother, became a police officer in 1995, directly inspired by Detective Morales's dedication to his sister's case. He spent 25 years in law enforcement, eventually becoming a detective himself. Miguel often said that every case he worked was, in some way, for Rebecca, an attempt to give other families the closure his own family had been denied for so long. Sofia, the youngest Martinez child, had been only 16 when Rebecca was murdered. She grew up in the shadow of her sister's death, feeling both the weight of her parents' grief and the pressure to somehow compensate for the daughter they had lost. She became a social worker, dedicating her career to helping children and families in crisis. The family had maintained traditions to honor Rebecca's memory. Every year on her birthday, they would visit her grave and then go to her favorite restaurant for dinner. They established a scholarship in her name at the University of Colorado Denver, which had helped dozens of education students complete their degrees. Carmen kept all of Rebecca's belongings exactly as she had left them, creating a kind of shrine that she visited daily. When Detective Chen called with the news that Robert Patterson had been identified as Rebecca's killer, each family member reacted differently. Eduardo felt a sense of vindication. He had always insisted that Rebecca's killer would eventually be caught. Carmen experienced relief mixed with sadness that Patterson was already dead. Miguel felt professional satisfaction that modern investigative techniques had finally solved his sister's case. Sofia, who had lived her entire adult life under the shadow of her sister's unsolved murder, felt like she could finally breathe freely. The family held a private memorial service for Rebecca after Patterson was identified, inviting the detectives who had worked on the case over the years. Detective Morales, now 89 and in poor health, attended via video call from his nursing home. He had tears in his eyes as he told the Martinez family that he had never stopped thinking about Rebecca and that he was grateful to see her case finally solved. While Robert Patterson's death meant there would be no criminal trial, the legal system still had work to do. The Denver District Attorney's Office officially closed the Rebecca Martinez homicide case on April 10, 2023, with a formal determination that Patterson was responsible for her murder. This legal closure was important for the family's peace of mind and for the historical record. District Attorney Maria Rodriguez held a ceremony to honor Rebecca's memory and to recognize the investigators who had worked on the case over the decades. Detective Frank Morales, though unable to attend in person, was given a special commendation for his dedication to the case during the crucial early years. Detective Sarah Chen was praised for her persistence in pursuing the forensic genealogy investigation. The resolution of Rebecca's case had implications beyond just one family's closure. It demonstrated the power of forensic genetic genealogy to solve decades-old crimes and brought attention to the hundreds of other cold cases that might be solvable using similar techniques. The Denver Police Department announced plans to review their entire cold case inventory to identify other cases that might benefit from genealogy investigations. The case also sparked discussions about privacy and ethics in genetic genealogy. While the Martinez family was grateful for the technology that solved Rebecca's case, others raised concerns about the use of consumer DNA databases for law enforcement purposes. The debate highlighted the tension between public safety and personal privacy in the digital age. Carmen Martinez became an advocate for forensic genetic genealogy, speaking at conferences and supporting legislation to fund cold case investigations. She argued that families like hers deserved answers, even decades after their loved ones were killed. Her advocacy helped secure state funding for Colorado's cold case unit to pursue additional genealogy investigations. The University of Colorado Denver held a special ceremony to honor Rebecca's memory and to announce an expansion of the scholarship program established in her name. The Rebecca Martinez Memorial Scholarship would now provide full tuition assistance to education students from low-income families, ensuring that Rebecca's dream of helping children would live on through future teachers. Jennifer Patterson, Robert's daughter, also found herself thrust into an uncomfortable spotlight. She cooperated fully with the investigation and expressed sincere remorse for her father's actions, but she also struggled with the knowledge that her father was a killer. She eventually moved away from Denver, seeking privacy and a fresh start for herself and her own children. The case generated significant media attention, including documentaries and true crime podcasts that examined both the original investigation and the modern techniques that led to its resolution. Detective Chen became a sought-after speaker on forensic genealogy, using Rebecca's case as an example of how persistence and new technology could bring justice even decades after a crime. Today, more than a year after Robert Patterson was identified as Rebecca Martinez's killer, the impact of her case continues to ripple through the criminal justice system and the Denver community. Rebecca's story has become a symbol of both the tragedy of violent crime and the power of persistence in seeking justice. The Rebecca Martinez case was among the first in Colorado to be solved through forensic genetic genealogy, paving the way for dozens of other cold cases to be reopened and investigated using similar techniques. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation has since solved more than 15 additional cold cases using genealogy methods, bringing closure to families who had waited years or decades for answers. Carmen Martinez, now in her late 70s, continues her advocacy work with renewed energy. She often speaks about the importance of never giving up hope, even when justice seems impossible. Her message resonates with other families dealing with unsolved crimes, and she has become a mentor to those navigating the long, difficult journey she once walked alone. Eduardo Martinez passed away peacefully in January 2024, 11 months after learning the identity of his daughter's killer. Family members said that finally knowing what happened to Rebecca brought him a sense of peace in his final months. He was buried next to Rebecca in Riverside Cemetery, the same cemetery where her body was found 37 years earlier. The scholarship program established in Rebecca's name has now helped more than 100 students complete their education degrees. Many of these teachers are working in Denver area schools, carrying forward Rebecca's dream of helping children learn and grow. In a very real sense, Rebecca Martinez is still teaching, still touching young lives, still making a difference in her community. Detective Sarah Chen was promoted to lieutenant in the cold case unit and now oversees genealogy investigations throughout Colorado. She keeps a photo of Rebecca Martinez on her desk as a reminder of what their work means to families and communities. Chen often says that Rebecca's case changed her understanding of what justice looks like. Sometimes it comes quickly, sometimes it takes decades, but it's always worth pursuing. Miguel Martinez retired from the Denver Police Department in 2023, after 28 years of service. He often reflected on how his sister's death shaped his career and his understanding of what it means to serve the community. At his retirement party, he dedicated his years of service to Rebecca's memory and to all the victims whose cases he had worked over the years. The technology that solved Rebecca's case continues to evolve. What took weeks of painstaking genealogy research in 2023 can now be accomplished in days or even hours. This rapid advancement means that many more cold cases will likely be solved in the coming years, bringing closure to families and justice for victims who have waited far too long. Rebecca Martinez would have been 56 years old today, perhaps a grandmother herself, maybe still teaching in a Denver classroom. Instead, she remains forever young in the memories of those who loved her, a 19-year-old with dreams of changing the world one student at a time. Her case serves as a powerful reminder that justice, though sometimes delayed, is not denied. It demonstrates the importance of preserving evidence, the dedication of investigators who refuse to give up, and the remarkable power of science to illuminate truths that have been hidden in darkness for decades. The streets of Denver are a little safer tonight because Robert Patterson can never hurt anyone again. The Martinez family finally has the answers they sought for 36 long years. And somewhere in a Denver classroom, a teacher inspired by Rebecca's scholarship is helping a child reach their potential, continuing the legacy of a young woman whose life was cut tragically short but whose impact continues to grow. As we close this chapter of Justice Served, we remember not just the crime that took Rebecca Martinez from her family, but the love, dedication, and persistence that ultimately brought her killer to light. In a world where so many cases go unsolved, Rebecca's story offers hope that truth will eventually emerge, that families will find peace, and that no victim is ever truly forgotten. The Rebecca Martinez case reminds us that behind every statistic, every cold case file, every DNA profile waiting for a match, there is a real person with dreams, family, and a future that was stolen from them. It challenges us to never stop seeking justice, never stop believing that answers are possible, and never stop fighting for those who can no longer fight for themselves. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember Rebecca Martinez, the girl who wanted to teach, the daughter who was loved, the victim who was not forgotten, and the symbol of how persistence, science, and hope can eventually triumph over even the darkest mysteries. Her story is one of tragedy transformed into justice, of a family's long journey finally reaching its destination, and of a community's commitment to ensuring that no crime, no matter how old, is ever truly cold. Please, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 3. Tonight, we're traveling to the Pacific Northwest, where the misty streets of Seattle hold secrets that remain unsolved. This is the story of Amanda Clark, a 28-year-old graphic designer whose vanishing on a cold February night in 2023 has left investigators puzzled and a community searching for answers. Amanda Marie Clark was born on October 15, 1994, in the suburbs of Bellevue, Washington. She was the kind of person who drew others in with her quiet confidence and infectious laugh. Her co-workers at Digital Northwest, a boutique design agency in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, described her as meticulous in her work but spontaneous in life. Amanda lived alone in a converted loft apartment on Pine Street, just a 15-minute walk from her office. The space reflected her artistic nature, exposed brick walls lined with her photography, plants cascading from every available surface, and a workspace that was organized chaos at its finest. She had routines, as most of us do. Tuesday evenings were for yoga at the community center on 12th Avenue. Thursdays meant dinner with her sister, Rachel, who lived across town in Fremont. Weekends often found her at Pike Place Market, camera in hand, capturing the life and energy of Seattle's beating heart. But Amanda also had her mysteries. She was intensely private about her romantic life, even with close friends. Her social media presence was minimal, a few carefully curated photos, mostly of her artwork and the city she loved. Those who knew her best said she seemed to be carrying something, a weight that she never quite shared with anyone. In the months before her disappearance, co-workers noticed subtle changes. Amanda seemed distracted, often staring out the window during meetings. She'd started working late more frequently, sometimes staying at the office until well past 10 o'clock. When asked about it, she'd simply smile and say she was working on something important. February 14, 2023, began like any other Tuesday for Amanda Clark. Valentine's Day held no special significance for her. She'd been single for over a year and seemed content with that status. Security footage from her apartment building shows her leaving at 8:23 a.m., her usual time, wearing a charcoal wool coat and carrying her distinctive red leather messenger bag. The morning at Digital Northwest proceeded normally. Amanda attended the weekly staff meeting at 9:30, where she presented mock-ups for a local restaurant's rebranding project. Her boss, Martin Torres, later told police that Amanda seemed completely normal, maybe even more focused than usual. Lunch was spent alone at her desk, as was typical for Tuesday. Amanda preferred to use the midday break to work on personal projects. Security cameras from the building's lobby captured her receiving a delivery around 1:15 p.m., a small package that she signed for personally rather than letting the receptionist handle it, which was unusual. The afternoon continued without incident until approximately 4:30 p.m., when Amanda received a phone call that lasted exactly 3 minutes and 17 seconds. Phone records would later show the call came from a prepaid cell phone that was never traced. After hanging up, Amanda sat motionless at her desk for several minutes, staring at her computer screen without typing. At 5:45 p.m., Amanda began packing up her workspace. This was early for her, especially on a Tuesday when she typically stayed until 7 or 8. She declined her coworker Sarah Kim's invitation to grab drinks, saying she had something important to take care of. The last verified sighting of Amanda at her office was captured by the elevator security camera at 6:03 p.m. She appeared calm, even checking her reflection in the polished elevator doors. Nothing in her demeanor suggested the fear or urgency that would characterize what happened next. Amanda's apartment building security footage shows her arriving home at 6:28 p.m., climbing the stairs to her third-floor loft as she had thousands of times before. Her neighbor, Mrs. Elena Vasquez, was retrieving her mail and exchanged brief pleasantries with Amanda about the unusually mild February weather. She seemed perfectly normal, Mrs. Vasquez would later tell investigators. Maybe a little tired, but she always looked tired on Tuesdays after her long days. She asked if I'd heard anything about the building's heating system, which was odd because there hadn't been any issues. Cell phone data shows Amanda's device connecting to her home Wi-Fi at 6:31 p.m. Over the next hour and 17 minutes, her phone showed typical usage patterns. She checked emails, browsed Instagram briefly, and sent a text message to her sister Rachel at 7:23 p.m. that simply read, "Rain check on Thursday dinner?" Something came up. At 7:48 p.m., Amanda's phone suddenly went silent. No more data usage, no calls, no texts. Digital forensics experts would later determine that the phone wasn't turned off, it simply stopped communicating with cell towers, suggesting it had either been damaged or moved to a location with no signal. Building security cameras captured Amanda leaving her apartment at 7:52 p.m. She wore different clothes than she'd arrived in, dark jeans, a black hoodie, and sneakers instead of the professional attire she'd worn to work. Most notably, she wasn't carrying her distinctive red messenger bag, which investigators would later find in her apartment, apparently packed as if for travel. The elevator camera shows Amanda pressing the button for the parking garage, not the lobby. She owned a silver 2019 Honda Civic, registered in her name, which she typically parked in space 23B. However, on this night, something was different. The garage's security system recorded her car leaving at 8:07 p.m., but there was a 15-minute gap between when Amanda entered the garage and when her car departed. More troubling was the traffic camera footage from Pine Street. Amanda's Honda Civic passed under the camera at 8:09 p.m., but image enhancement revealed that the driver's silhouette didn't match Amanda's usual driving posture. The figure behind the wheel appeared taller, with broader shoulders. This was the last confirmed sighting of Amanda's vehicle. It seemed to vanish into the Seattle night, taking with it any answers about what had happened to Amanda Clark. Amanda's sister Rachel was the first to realize something was wrong. When Amanda didn't respond to her text messages on Wednesday morning and failed to answer her phone, Rachel initially assumed her sister was simply busy with work. But when Amanda missed their regular Thursday dinner without any communication, Rachel's concern escalated to alarm. Rachel arrived at Amanda's apartment building on Friday evening, February 17, after 3 days of unsuccessful attempts to reach her sister. The building manager, persuaded by Rachel's obvious distress, agreed to perform a wellness check. Using his master key, they entered Amanda's loft to find a scene that was both ordinary and deeply unsettling. The apartment was neat, almost pristinely so. Amanda's bed was made with military precision, her dishes were clean and put away, and her artwork remained undisturbed on the walls. However, trained eyes would notice the subtle signs of hasty preparation. Her bathroom toiletries were arranged too perfectly, as if someone had quickly cleaned and organized the space. Most significantly, Amanda's red messenger bag, the one she carried everywhere, sat on her kitchen counter, packed with items that suggested she'd been planning to leave: extra underwear, a toothbrush, phone charger, and $347 in cash. But her wallet, containing her ID and credit cards, was missing, as were her car keys and the mysterious package she'd received at work on Tuesday. Rachel immediately contacted the Seattle Police Department. Detective Marcus Rivera, a 15-year veteran of the Missing Persons Unit, was assigned to the case. His initial assessment was cautious but concerning. While there was no immediate evidence of foul play, the circumstances didn't align with a voluntary disappearance. Amanda Clark was methodical in everything she did, Detective Rivera explained in his case notes. For her to leave without telling anyone, especially her sister, was completely out of character. And the discrepancies in the security footage suggested this wasn't a simple case of someone needing space. The police investigation began immediately. Amanda's Honda Civic was entered into the National Crime Information Center database as a vehicle of interest. Her photo was distributed to local media, though it wouldn't receive widespread coverage for several more days. Detective Rivera's team began the painstaking process of reconstructing Amanda's final days. They interviewed her co-workers, friends, and neighbors. They analyzed her phone records, bank statements, and digital footprint. Slowly, a picture began to emerge of a woman who had been living with increasing anxiety in the weeks before her disappearance. Amanda's computer revealed she'd been researching personal security topics, articles about being followed, how to detect surveillance, and even guides for disappearing safely. Her browser history showed searches for temporary housing, cash-only rentals, and information about changing one's identity. Even more intriguing was what investigators didn't find. There were no recent romantic interests, no threatening messages, no financial troubles that might explain her behavior. Amanda Clark appeared to be a woman preparing to vanish, but the reason remained maddeningly elusive. In the digital age, disappearing completely requires considerable skill and planning. Amanda Clark, despite her artistic background, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of digital privacy that surprised even experienced investigators. Her laptop revealed evidence of extensive research into online anonymity. She'd downloaded Tor browser software, researched VPN services, and even explored cryptocurrency exchanges. Most telling was a deleted folder that digital forensics experts were able to recover, containing articles about witness protection programs and guides for people fleeing domestic violence. Detective Rivera brought in cyber crime specialist Officer Janet Kim to analyze Amanda's digital behavior. Officer Kim discovered that Amanda had been using multiple email accounts, some dating back only a few weeks before her disappearance. She'd also created several social media profiles under different names, though these accounts remained inactive. This level of preparation suggests Amanda knew she might need to disappear, Officer Kim noted in her report. But it also indicates she was afraid of something or someone specific. People don't learn these techniques for fun. Phone records revealed an interesting pattern. In the 3 weeks before her disappearance, Amanda had received 17 calls from different numbers, all lasting less than 30 seconds. When investigators attempted to trace these numbers, they discovered most were from prepaid phones that had been discarded after single uses. Bank records showed unusual activity as well. Starting in January 2023, Amanda had been making small cash withdrawals, never more than $200 at a time, from different ATMs around the city. Over 6 weeks, she'd accumulated nearly $3,000 in cash, money that was never found in her apartment. Her credit card activity painted a picture of someone preparing for an extended absence. She'd purchased non-perishable foods, basic camping equipment, and a prepaid phone that was never found. Most significantly, she'd bought a one-way ticket to Portland, Oregon, scheduled for February 16, a ticket she never used. The Portland connection puzzled investigators. Amanda had no known ties to the city, no friends or family there. When detectives contacted Portland Police Department, they discovered no reports of anyone matching Amanda's description, no Jane Doe cases that might be connected. The package Amanda received at work on February 14 became a crucial piece of the puzzle. Security footage showed a standard delivery truck, but attempts to identify the courier service proved fruitless. The company listed on the driver's uniform didn't exist, and the license plate was registered to a vehicle that had been reported stolen 3 days earlier in Tacoma. Amanda's co-workers remembered her unusual reaction to receiving the package. Sarah Kim, who sat nearest to Amanda's desk, noticed that Amanda had opened it immediately rather than setting it aside as she typically did with personal deliveries. She went completely pale, Sarah told investigators. I asked if everything was okay, and she just nodded and shoved whatever it was into her desk drawer. She was distracted for the rest of the day. Despite extensive searches of Amanda's apartment and workspace, the contents of that package were never found. Her desk drawer contained only standard office supplies and a few personal items, a lip balm, some mints, and a small notebook filled with design sketches. The notebook itself provided another mystery. The final entry, dated February 14, wasn't a design sketch but rather a series of numbers, 47.6062, -122.3321. Detective Rivera immediately recognized these as GPS coordinates pointing to a location in Seattle's International District. When investigators visited the coordinates, they found themselves standing outside a small import shop that had been closed for over 2 years. The building's owner, contacted through property records, confirmed that the space had been vacant since late 2020 when the previous tenant, an elderly Chinese immigrant named Mr. Chen, had passed away from COVID-19. Security cameras from nearby businesses showed no unusual activity around the building in the days before or after Amanda's disappearance. However, a homeless individual who frequently slept in the alley behind the building told police he'd seen someone with a flashlight inside the vacant store around midnight on February 14. Figured it was the owner or something, the man explained. But it was weird, 'cause I never seen anyone there before, and they were only inside for maybe 10 minutes. By March 1, 2023, Amanda Clark's disappearance had captured Seattle's attention. Local news stations picked up the story, highlighting the mysterious circumstances and the complete lack of leads. Amanda's photo appeared on billboards throughout the city, and her case was featured on several true crime podcasts. The Seattle Police Department expanded their investigation, bringing in additional detectives and consulting with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. A command center was established, and tips began pouring in from across the Pacific Northwest. Search teams combed through Seattle's parks, waterways, and abandoned buildings. Dive teams explored the waters of Elliott Bay and Lake Washington. Volunteers distributed flyers throughout the city, and vigils were held in Amanda's honor. Rachel Clark became the public face of the search for her sister. She appeared on local television, pleading with anyone who might have information to come forward. She established a website dedicated to finding Amanda and offered a $50,000 reward for information leading to her safe return. Amanda isn't the type of person to just disappear, Rachel told reporters. She's responsible, caring, and she would never put our family through this kind of pain voluntarily. Someone knows something, and we're begging them to speak up. Despite the extensive media coverage and public involvement, substantial leads remained elusive. Tips ranged from reported sightings in Vancouver, British Columbia, to claims that Amanda had been seen boarding buses in various cities across the western United States. Each lead was investigated thoroughly, but none provided concrete evidence of Amanda's whereabouts. The case began to take on a life of its own in Seattle's true crime community. Amateur investigators created detailed timelines, analyzed security footage frame by frame, and developed theories about what might have happened to Amanda. While most of these efforts were well-intentioned, they also created noise that made the official investigation more challenging. 3 months after Amanda's disappearance, in May 2023, a breakthrough finally came from an unexpected source. A construction crew renovating a building in Seattle's Pioneer Square discovered a storage unit key hidden inside a wall cavity. The key was attached to a keychain featuring a small metal charm in the shape of a camera, identical to one Amanda was known to carry. The storage unit, located in a facility in nearby Tukwila, had been rented under the name Marshall and paid for 6 months in advance with cash. Security footage from the storage facility showed a figure in dark clothing and a baseball cap accessing the unit on February 13, the day before Amanda's disappearance. Inside the unit, investigators made a chilling discovery. Amanda's missing red messenger bag sat on a shelf, but it was nearly empty except for a single photograph, a picture of Amanda herself, taken with a telephoto lens outside her apartment building. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "Soon," in block letters. The storage unit also contained a detailed map of Seattle with various locations marked in red ink, including Amanda's apartment, her workplace, and several other spots around the city. Most disturbing was a schedule that matched Amanda's routine perfectly: her gym times, grocery shopping patterns, even her preferred coffee shop and the days she typically visited. This evidence transformed the investigation from a missing person case to a potential abduction. The level of surveillance documented in the storage unit indicated that someone had been watching Amanda for weeks, possibly months, before her disappearance. Today, more than a year after Amanda Clark vanished into the Seattle night, her case remains open and active. The discovery of the storage unit provided crucial evidence that Amanda was likely the victim of a crime, but it also raised more questions than it answered. Who had been watching Amanda so carefully? Why had she been targeted? And most importantly, where is Amanda Clark now? Detective Rivera, still leading the investigation, believes the answers lie somewhere in Amanda's past, a connection she may not have even been aware of that put her in someone's crosshairs. The investigation continues, with federal resources now involved and a renewed focus on Amanda's digital communications and background. Rachel Clark maintains the website dedicated to finding her sister and continues to advocate for increased resources for missing person cases. The reward for information about Amanda's whereabouts has grown to $75,000, contributed by family, friends, and members of the Seattle community who refuse to let her story be forgotten. Amanda's case has highlighted the vulnerabilities that exist in our connected world, how someone can be watched, studied, and potentially taken without leaving traditional evidence behind. It's a reminder that even in our modern age, people can vanish, leaving behind only questions and the hope that somewhere, somehow, they might still be found. As we conclude our journey into this ongoing mystery, Amanda Clark's face continues to look out for missing person posters throughout Seattle. Her story serves as both a cautionary tale and a call to action, a reminder to stay aware, to look out for one another, and to never stop asking questions when someone we care about is no longer there to answer. The search for Amanda Clark continues, and perhaps someday, the streets of Seattle will finally reveal their secrets and bring her home. Please, if you're still awake and listening, don't forget to comment where you're listening from and the current time in your corner of the world. Also, be sure to like this video and subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss our daily true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our next story. Story 4. As we all know, sometimes justice arrives like morning light after the longest night, slowly, then suddenly, illuminating truths that have been hidden in darkness for decades. Tonight, I want to tell you about one such case, where persistence, technology, and an unshakable belief in doing what's right finally brought answers to a family that had waited 52 years for the truth. This is the story of Rita Curran, a beloved fourth-grade teacher whose life was cut short in the summer of 1971, and how advances in DNA technology finally revealed her killer's identity in 2023. It's a story that spans generations, involves cutting-edge science, and proves that sometimes, the truth refuses to stay buried forever. Rita Marie Curran was the kind of teacher children remembered long after they'd left her classroom. In the spring of 1971, she was 24 years old, with bright hazel eyes and an infectious enthusiasm for learning that made even the most reluctant students excited about reading and arithmetic. Rita taught fourth grade at Champlain Elementary School in Burlington, Vermont, a red brick building that sat on a tree-lined street where children could safely walk to school each morning. She'd been teaching there for 3 years, and in that short time, she'd become one of the most beloved educators in the district. Miss Curran made learning feel like an adventure, recalled David Henderson, who was 9 years old when he was in Rita's class. Speaking to reporters 50 years later, his voice still carried the warmth of that childhood memory. She had this way of making every child feel special, like they had something important to contribute to the world. Rita had grown up in Burlington, the daughter of working-class parents who'd instilled in her a deep belief in the power of education. Her father, James, worked at the local paper mill, while her mother, Margaret, cleaned houses to help make ends meet. Rita was the first person in her family to attend college, earning her teaching degree from the University of Vermont in 1968. Even as a child, Rita had shown a natural gift for working with younger children. She'd often volunteer to help with Sunday school at St. Anthony's Catholic Church, where her patience and kindness made her a favorite among the parish families. Father Michael O'Brien, who knew Rita since she was confirmed at age 14, would later say, Rita had a calling to teach. You could see it in how she lit up when she was around children. By the summer of 1971, Rita had just finished her 3rd year of teaching and was already making plans for the fall semester. She'd been accepted into a master's program in elementary education and was excited about bringing new teaching methods to her classroom. Her principal, Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, had recommended Rita for the advanced program, noting in her letter of recommendation that Miss Curran possesses that rare combination of natural teaching ability and intellectual curiosity that makes for truly exceptional educators. Rita lived alone in a modest second-floor apartment at 321 Brooks Avenue, a quiet residential street about 10 minutes from the school. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with books, student artwork, and the materials she used to prepare lessons during the summer months. Her neighbors described her as friendly but quiet, someone who kept regular hours and often sat on her porch in the evenings, grading papers or reading. She had been dating a fellow teacher named Mark Stevens for about 8 months. Mark taught high school history at Burlington High and shared Rita's passion for education and social justice. They'd met at a teachers' union meeting and had been talking about getting engaged, though they'd agreed to wait until Rita finished her master's degree. Rita was the most genuine person I'd ever met, Mark would tell police investigators after her death. She saw the good in everyone and believed that education could solve most of the world's problems. She was going to make such a difference in this world. That summer, Rita was working part-time at a local bookstore and spending her evenings preparing for the upcoming school year. She'd been particularly excited about a new reading program she wanted to implement, one that would help struggling students build confidence while challenging advanced readers. It was exactly the kind of innovative thinking that made Rita special as an educator. On the evening of July 19, 1971, Rita finished her shift at the bookstore and stopped by the grocery store to pick up ingredients for dinner. The clerk at the store, Mrs. Dorothy Kim, remembered Rita because she was always so polite and often bought fresh flowers for her apartment. She had such a beautiful smile, Mrs. Kim would later recall. Even after a long day, she always took time to ask about my family. Rita returned to her apartment around 7:30 p.m. that evening, carrying a bag of groceries and a small bouquet of daisies. A neighbor, Mrs. Frances Kellner, saw her climbing the stairs to her second-floor apartment and waved from her garden. It was the last time anyone would see Rita Curran alive. What happened next would haunt the Burlington community for more than half a century, and it would take advances in forensic science that couldn't even be imagined in 1971 to finally bring Rita's killer to justice. Mrs. Frances Kellner was watering her roses at 7:45 a.m. on July 20th when she noticed that Rita's morning routine seemed off. Every day for the past 3 years, Rita would leave her apartment at exactly 8:15 a.m. to walk to the bookstore for her summer job. Mrs. Kellner had grown accustomed to seeing Rita's cheerful wave as she headed down Brooks Avenue, often stopping to pet the neighborhood cats or chat with other early morning walkers. But on this Tuesday morning, Rita's apartment was silent. The curtains were still drawn, and there was no sign of movement. Mrs. Kellner found this unusual enough to mention to her husband over breakfast, but they both assumed Rita might be feeling under the weather or had decided to sleep in. By noon, when Rita failed to show up for her shift at Henderson's Books, the store owner, Mr. Robert Henderson, began to worry. Rita had never missed work without calling, and she'd seemed perfectly fine the evening before when she'd helped close the store. Mr. Henderson tried calling Rita's apartment, but there was no answer. Concerned, Mr. Henderson called Mark Stevens at the high school where he was teaching summer school. Mark immediately left work and drove to Rita's apartment building on Brooks Avenue. He knocked on her door repeatedly and called her name, but received no response. The building's landlord, Mrs. Elena Rothschild, lived on the first floor and came out to see what was happening. "I haven't heard anything from Miss Curran since yesterday evening," Mrs. Rothschild told Mark. "Her car is still in the parking lot, and I didn't hear her radio this morning like usual." Mark's worry turned to genuine alarm. Rita always listened to the morning news while getting ready for work, it was part of her daily routine. The silence from her apartment was completely out of character. After some persuasion, Mrs. Rothschild agreed to use her master key to check on Rita's welfare. What they found when they opened the door to Rita's apartment would forever change the lives of everyone who knew her. Rita was lying on the floor of her small living room, clearly deceased. Even from the doorway, it was apparent that she had been the victim of a violent crime. Mark immediately called the police while Mrs. Rothschild, despite her shock, had the presence of mind to usher the growing crowd of concerned neighbors away from the scene. Burlington Police Detective Lieutenant Robert Morrison arrived within 10 minutes of the call. A 15-year veteran of the force, Morrison had worked numerous crime scenes, but he would later say that Rita's case affected him more deeply than any other. The brutality of the crime, combined with Rita's reputation as a beloved teacher, created a sense of urgency that would drive the investigation for decades to come. The initial examination revealed that Rita had been sexually assaulted and murdered in her own living room. The apartment showed signs of a struggle, furniture was overturned, Rita's purse had been emptied onto the floor, and there were clear signs that her attacker had spent considerable time in the apartment after the murder. What struck investigators immediately was that this didn't appear to be a random burglary gone wrong. While Rita's purse had been searched, her jewelry and the small amount of cash in her apartment had been left untouched. The level of violence suggested someone with a personal motive, or possibly someone with serious psychological problems. Dr. Patricia Manning, the medical examiner, determined that Rita had died sometime between 8 o'clock and 10 p.m. on July 19. The cause of death was strangulation, though she had also suffered significant blunt force trauma to her head. The sexual assault appeared to have occurred before her death, suggesting that Rita had endured a prolonged and terrifying ordeal. Perhaps most importantly for the investigation that would follow, Dr. Manning was able to collect biological evidence from Rita's body and from beneath her fingernails, where she had clearly fought against her attacker. In 1971, DNA analysis didn't exist, but investigators carefully preserved all the physical evidence, not knowing that it would prove crucial 52 years later. News of Rita's murder spread quickly through Burlington's tight-knit community. The local newspaper, the Burlington Free Press, ran the story on the front page the next day under the headline, "Beloved Teacher Murdered in Home." The article described Rita as a dedicated educator whose infectious enthusiasm for learning touched the lives of hundreds of children. The response from the community was immediate and overwhelming. Parents who had children in Rita's class, fellow teachers, and even people who had only known Rita casually came forward to offer information and assistance to the police. A fund was established to help with funeral expenses, and more than 800 people attended Rita's memorial service at St. Anthony's Catholic Church. But despite the outpouring of community support and the dedication of the Burlington Police Department, Rita Curran's murder would remain unsolved for more than half a century, becoming one of Vermont's most frustrating cold cases. Detective Lieutenant Robert Morrison threw himself into Rita's case with the kind of intensity that would define his career for the next 3 decades. A methodical investigator with an eye for detail, Morrison understood that the first 48 hours after a murder were crucial, and he was determined not to let any lead go unexplored. The investigation began with Rita's personal life, as most murder cases involve someone known to the victim. Morrison and his team conducted extensive interviews with Rita's family, friends, colleagues, and students' parents. They spoke with Mark Stevens multiple times, not because he was considered a suspect, but because he knew Rita better than anyone and might provide insights into her state of mind or any concerns she'd had. Mark was able to provide a detailed account of Rita's activities in the days leading up to her death. They'd had dinner together on July 17 and had made plans to see a movie the following weekend. Rita had seemed her usual cheerful self, excited about the upcoming school year and looking forward to starting her master's program in the fall. She wasn't worried about anything, Mark told investigators. Rita was one of those people who looked for the good in every situation. If she'd been concerned about someone or something, she would have mentioned it. Morrison's team also interviewed Rita's neighbors extensively. The apartment building on Brooks Avenue was small, with only 6 units, and the residents generally knew each other well. Everyone described Rita as quiet, friendly, and considerate. No one had heard any unusual sounds on the evening of July 19, though the building's older construction meant that noise didn't carry well between units. Mrs. Kellner, the neighbor who had noticed Rita's absence, provided the most detailed timeline. She'd seen Rita return from the grocery store around 7:30 p.m., carrying groceries and flowers. About an hour later, around 8:30, Mrs. Kellner had heard a car door slam in the parking lot, but she hadn't looked out to see who it was. Cars came and went at all hours, Mrs. Kellner explained. The young man in Unit 4 worked second shift, and the couple in Unit 6 often went out in the evenings. I didn't think anything of it at the time. This detail about the car door became important when investigators realized that Rita's murder had likely occurred between 8 o'clock and 10 p.m. If Mrs. Kellner had heard someone leaving around 8:30, it might have been Rita's killer. The investigation expanded to include anyone who might have had contact with Rita in her professional life. Morrison's team interviewed every parent of children Rita had taught, looking for anyone who might have developed an unhealthy obsession with the young teacher. They also spoke with school maintenance staff, substitute teachers, and even sales representatives who regularly visited the school. This line of inquiry proved particularly challenging because Rita was universally well-liked. Parents praised her dedication and skill as an educator, and there were no reports of any inappropriate behavior or concerning interactions. If someone had been fixated on Rita, they had kept it well hidden. Morrison also looked into the possibility that Rita's murder was connected to other crimes in the area. In 1971, the concept of serial killers wasn't well understood, but experienced investigators knew to look for patterns. A review of similar crimes in Vermont and neighboring states revealed several unsolved sexual assaults, but none that appeared directly connected to Rita's case. The physical evidence collected from Rita's apartment was processed using the forensic techniques available in 1971. Fingerprints were lifted from various surfaces, but most belonged to Rita herself or to people who had legitimate reasons to be in her apartment. Blood samples were analyzed for type, and investigators were able to determine that some of the blood found at the scene didn't match Rita's type, suggesting it belonged to her attacker. Most significantly, the biological evidence collected from Rita's body and fingernails was carefully preserved. Dr. Manning, the medical examiner, had the foresight to recognize that forensic science was rapidly advancing, and she made sure that samples were stored properly in case new testing methods became available in the future. As weeks turned into months, Morrison's investigation began to slow. He'd followed every lead, interviewed hundreds of people, and processed all the physical evidence available with 1971 technology. Despite his best efforts, the case was gradually classified as cold, though Morrison never stopped thinking about Rita Curran and the promise he'd made to her family to find her killer. Morrison retired from the Burlington Police Department in 1998, 27 years after Rita's murder. On his last day, he placed a handwritten note in Rita's case file: "This case deserves to be solved. Rita Curran was a good person who died violently, and her family deserves answers. I hope someday science will give us what determination couldn't." Morrison couldn't have known that his hope would be fulfilled 25 years later, when advances in DNA technology and genetic genealogy would finally identify Rita's killer and bring the justice that had eluded investigators for half a century. For 30 years after Rita's murder, her case file sat in a metal cabinet in the Burlington Police Department's cold case section. The thick folder contained hundreds of pages of interview notes, crime scene photographs, evidence logs, and the hopes of investigators who had worked the case over the decades. Every few years, a new detective would pull Rita's file and take a fresh look at the evidence. In 1982, Detective Sarah Chen spent 6 months re-interviewing witnesses and following up on tips that had come in over the years. She discovered that one of Rita's former students, now in high school, remembered seeing a strange man hanging around the elementary school in the weeks before the murder, but the lead ultimately went nowhere. In 1991, Detective Michael Rodriguez used newly available computer databases to cross-reference Rita's case with similar crimes across New England. He found several cases with similarities: young women attacked in their apartments, sexual assault, and strangulation, but DNA technology wasn't yet advanced enough to determine if they were connected. The most promising development came in 1998, when the Burlington Police Department received a federal grant to begin DNA testing on cold cases. Rita's case was among the first to be reviewed, and the biological evidence that had been carefully preserved since 1971 yielded a complete DNA profile of her attacker. Detective Lisa Thompson, who was assigned to the newly formed cold case unit, was excited about the possibilities this created. For the first time since 1971, we had something concrete to work with, Thompson later recalled. We had the killer's genetic fingerprint. Now we just had to find him. The DNA profile was entered into the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database. Thompson and her team waited hopefully for a match, but none came. The man who had killed Rita Curran had apparently never been arrested for a crime serious enough to require DNA submission, or if he had been arrested, it was before mandatory DNA collection was implemented. Thompson tried several other approaches. She had the DNA profile compared to evidence from similar unsolved cases, looking for connections to other crimes. She worked with the Vermont State Police to publicize the case, hoping that media attention might shake loose new information. She even consulted with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit to develop a psychological profile of Rita's killer. The profile suggested that Rita's murderer was likely a white male between the ages of 20 and 35 in 1971, which would make him between 50 and 65 in 2000 when the profile was completed. He probably lived or worked in the Burlington area and may have had some connection to the education field, given that he had targeted a teacher. The level of violence suggested someone with significant psychological problems, possibly including previous sexual offenses. While this information was helpful for understanding the type of person they were looking for, it didn't bring investigators any closer to identifying a specific suspect. The DNA profile remained in the database, waiting for a match that never came. Rita's family never gave up hope that her case would be solved. Her sister, Patricia Curran Walsh, became an advocate for cold case investigations and victims' rights. She regularly contacted the Burlington Police Department for updates and often spoke at conferences about the importance of keeping cold cases active. Rita died when she was just 24 years old, Patricia would tell audiences. She was going to be a great teacher, maybe a principal someday. She wanted to make a difference in children's lives. Her killer stole all of that from her, and from all the students she would have taught over the years. Patricia also kept Rita's memory alive in other ways. She established a scholarship fund at the University of Vermont for students studying elementary education, and she worked with the Burlington School District to name the library at Champlain Elementary in Rita's honor. Every year on the anniversary of Rita's death, Patricia would place flowers on her sister's grave and renew her promise to keep fighting for justice. As the years passed, some people suggested that Rita's case would never be solved. The evidence was old, witnesses had died or moved away, and whoever had killed Rita might be dead himself. But Patricia refused to accept that possibility. "I know in my heart that someday we'll have answers," Patricia told a reporter on the 40th anniversary of Rita's death in 2011. "Science keeps advancing, and there are people who refuse to give up on cases like Rita's. My sister deserves justice, and I believe she'll get it." Patricia's faith would prove to be well-founded. Within just over a decade, advances in genetic genealogy would finally provide the answers that traditional investigation and DNA database searches had failed to deliver for more than 50 years. In 2019, the Burlington Police Department made a decision that would change everything for Rita's case. Chief Brandon Del Pozo, recognizing that the department's cold cases might benefit from new advances in forensic genetic genealogy, allocated funding to partner with a specialized laboratory that could perform this cutting-edge analysis. Forensic genetic genealogy had gained national attention through high-profile cases like the Golden State Killer, where investigators had used DNA evidence and public genealogy databases to identify suspects in decades-old crimes. The process involved taking a DNA profile from a crime scene and comparing it to genetic information that people had voluntarily uploaded to genealogy websites like GMatch and Family Tree DNA. Detective Amanda Foster was assigned to oversee the genetic genealogy project for Burlington PD. Foster had joined the department in 2015 and had quickly developed a reputation as a thorough and innovative investigator. When she learned that Rita's case would be among the first to undergo genetic genealogy analysis, she felt the weight of responsibility that had been carried by investigators for nearly 50 years. "I knew Rita's story from the day I joined the department," Foster explained. "Every cop in Burlington knew about the teacher who was murdered in 1971. It was one of those cases that defined us as a department. We'd never been able to solve it, but we'd never stop trying." The genetic genealogy analysis was performed by Parabon Nanolabs, a company that specialized in using DNA evidence to identify suspects and victims in cold cases. The process began with the high-quality DNA profile that had been developed from evidence in Rita's case, then used advanced techniques to predict the physical characteristics and ancestry of her killer. Parabon's analysis suggested that Rita's attacker was of Northern European ancestry, with light skin, brown or hazel eyes, and brown hair. While this information was interesting, it was the genealogical analysis that would prove most valuable. Using the DNA profile, Parabon's genealogists built family trees connecting Rita's killer to distant relatives who had uploaded their DNA to public genealogy databases. The work was painstaking and complex, involving hundreds of hours of research into birth records, death certificates, marriage licenses, and family histories. After 6 months of analysis, Parabon provided Burlington police with a list of potential suspects, men who fit the age and geographic criteria and whose family trees connected them to the DNA evidence from Rita's case. At the top of that list was a name that would shock everyone involved in the investigation: William DeRoos. DeRoos had been 31 years old in 1971 and had lived in Burlington at the time of Rita's murder. He worked as a maintenance supervisor at the University of Vermont, a job that would have given him knowledge of the local area and possibly brought him into contact with education professionals. Most remarkably, DeRoos had died in 1986, which explained why his DNA had never appeared in any criminal database. Detective Foster began researching DeRoos's background and quickly discovered information that made him an even more compelling suspect. In 1975, 4 years after Rita's murder, DeRoos had been arrested for sexual assault in Burlington. The charges were eventually dropped due to lack of evidence, but the incident showed that DeRoos had a history of the type of behavior that had led to Rita's murder. Foster also learned that DeRoos had lived only 8 blocks from Rita's apartment in 1971. His work schedule at the university would have allowed him to be in the area during the evening hours when Rita was killed. And according to employment records, DeRoos had been reprimanded several times for inappropriate behavior toward female students and staff members. The circumstantial evidence was compelling, but Foster needed definitive proof that DeRoos was Rita's killer. That proof would come from an unexpected source: DeRoos's own family. Getting DNA confirmation that William DeRoos was Rita's killer required careful planning and sensitivity. DeRoos had been dead for 37 years, but he had living relatives who could provide genetic material for comparison. Detective Foster needed to approach this situation delicately, as these family members had no idea that their relative might have been involved in a decades-old murder. Foster worked with the Vermont State Attorney's Office to develop a strategy for obtaining comparison samples. They decided to approach DeRoos's adult children, explaining that their father's DNA might help solve a cold case without initially revealing the specific nature of the crime. DeRoos's son, Michael DeRoos, was contacted first. Now in his 50s and living in New Hampshire, Michael agreed to meet with Detective Foster after she explained that his father's DNA might be relevant to an old investigation. Michael had been only 12 years old when his father died and had limited memories of him. "My father wasn't really in my life much even before he died," Michael told Foster during their initial meeting. "My parents divorced when I was young, and he had a lot of problems with drinking and anger. I always wondered if there were things about him that I didn't know." When Foster explained that his father was suspected of being involved in a 1971 murder, Michael was shocked but not entirely surprised. He agreed to provide a DNA sample and also shared information about his father's behavior that further supported the theory that William DeRoos was Rita's killer. "He had a terrible temper, especially when he'd been drinking," Michael recalled. "And he said inappropriate things about women all the time. My mother left him because she was afraid of him. She never told me the details, but I always sensed there was more to the story." DeRoos's daughter, Susan DeRoos Martinez, was initially reluctant to get involved in the investigation. She had worked hard to distance herself from her father's legacy and was concerned about how publicity around the case might affect her own family. However, after learning the details of Rita's murder and understanding the pain that Rita's family had endured for 50 years, she also agreed to provide a DNA sample. "If my father hurt that poor woman, then her family deserves to know the truth," Susan told Foster. "Rita Curran didn't deserve what happened to her, and her sister Patricia has been fighting for justice for so long. If I can help end their suffering, I have to do it." The DNA comparison was performed at the Vermont State Police Crime Laboratory, with additional confirmation testing done by the FBI. The results were unambiguous: William DeRoos was the source of the biological evidence found on Rita Curran's body and at the crime scene in 1971. After 52 years, Rita's killer had finally been identified. Detective Foster called Patricia Curran Walsh on a Thursday morning in March 2023 to share the news. Patricia, now in her 70s, had been waiting for this phone call for most of her adult life. "Patricia, this is Detective Foster from Burlington PD," Foster said. I'm calling to tell you that we've identified the man who killed your sister Rita." The silence on the other end of the line lasted for nearly 30 seconds before Patricia spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you sure?" Patricia asked. "After all these years, are you really sure?" "We're absolutely certain," Foster replied. "His name was William DeRoos, and the DNA evidence is conclusive. He can't be prosecuted because he died in 1986, but we know without a doubt that he's the one who murdered Rita." Patricia cried for several minutes before she could speak again. When she did, her first words were about Rita. "She was such a good person," Patricia said through her tears. "She just wanted to teach children and make the world a better place. Why would someone do that to her?" It was a question that would never have a satisfactory answer, but at least Rita's family finally had the one thing they'd been seeking for more than half a century: the truth. As Detective Foster continued her investigation into William DeRoos, a disturbing picture emerged of a man whose life had been marked by violence, addiction, and antisocial behavior. The more she learned about DeRoos, the clearer it became that Rita's murder had not been an isolated incident but rather the most extreme expression of a pattern of dangerous behavior. DeRoos was born in 1940 in Rutland, Vermont, the youngest of 4 children in a family marked by dysfunction and abuse. His father was an alcoholic who frequently beat his wife and children, and his mother struggled with mental illness that went untreated in an era when such conditions were poorly understood. By the time DeRoos was 16, he had been arrested multiple times for petty theft, vandalism, and fighting. Military service in the early 1960s provided some structure to DeRoos's life, but it didn't address his underlying psychological problems. He served 2 years in the Army without major incident, but his discharge papers noted concerns about his temper and his difficulty following orders. After leaving the military, DeRoos drifted from job to job, never staying in one place for very long. He moved to Burlington in 1969, taking a job as a maintenance worker at the University of Vermont. The position provided steady income and benefits, and for a while, DeRoos seemed to be stabilizing his life. He married a local woman named Carol Peterson in 1970, and they had 2 children together over the next few years. But DeRoos's problems were never far from the surface. Co-workers at the university later told investigators that he had an explosive temper and made inappropriate comments about female students and staff members. There were several complaints about his behavior, but in the early 1970s, such issues were often overlooked or handled informally. Carol DeRoos filed for divorce in 1974, citing mental cruelty and fears for her safety. In court documents that Detective Foster discovered in archived files, Carol described a pattern of escalating violence and controlling behavior. DeRoos had begun drinking heavily, staying out all night, and becoming increasingly paranoid and aggressive. "He would accuse me of having affairs, even though I never gave him any reason to think that," Carol wrote in her petition for divorce. "He would follow me when I went shopping or visited friends. He said he could kill me and nobody would ever find my body." The divorce was finalized in 1975, the same year that DeRoos was arrested for sexual assault. The victim in that case was a young woman who worked at a restaurant near the university. She told police that DeRoos had followed her home after her shift, forced his way into her apartment, and attempted to rape her. She fought him off and managed to call for help, but the incident left her traumatized. DeRoos was charged with attempted sexual assault and breaking and entering, but the case never went to trial. The victim, who was only 19 years old, was reluctant to testify against DeRoos, and without her cooperation, prosecutors felt they couldn't secure a conviction. The charges were dropped, and DeRoos returned to his job at the university. This information was particularly significant because it showed that DeRoos had attempted a very similar crime just 4 years after Rita's murder. The pattern was clear: he targeted young women who lived alone, used his knowledge of their routines to plan his attacks, and employed overwhelming violence to control his victims. Foster also discovered that DeRoos had been questioned about other crimes during the 1970s. In 1973, a female graduate student at the University of Vermont reported that someone had broken into her apartment and sexually assaulted her while she slept. The victim couldn't identify her attacker, but the method of entry and the type of assault were consistent with DeRusa's behavior. In 1976, a secretary at the university filed a complaint saying that DeRusa had been stalking her, following her to her car after work and making threatening phone calls to her home. The university gave DeRusa a formal reprimand, but he wasn't fired or arrested. DeRusa's behavior continued to deteriorate throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. He was arrested multiple times for public intoxication, disorderly conduct, and assault. His ex-wife Carol obtained a restraining order against him in 1978 after he showed up at her home drunk and threatening. The pattern of escalating violence and antisocial behavior continued until his death in 1986. DeRusa died of liver failure at age 46, his body ravaged by decades of alcohol abuse. At the time of his death, he was estranged from his children and had been fired from his job at the university for excessive absences and inappropriate behavior. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Burlington, with only a handful of people attending his funeral. Looking at William DeRusa's life, it's clear that Rita Kern wasn't his only victim, Detective Foster concluded. He was a predator who targeted vulnerable women for years. Rita's murder was the worst thing he did, but it wasn't the only terrible thing. Understanding DeRusa's background helped explain how Rita's murder had happened, but it couldn't ease the pain that her family and friends had carried for more than 50 years. The revelation that Rita had been killed by a man with a long history of violence was both validating and heartbreaking, validating because it confirmed that her death hadn't been random or meaningless, but heartbreaking because it showed how many warning signs had been missed. On April 15, 2023, Burlington Police Chief John Murad held a press conference to announce that Rita Kern's 1971 murder had been solved. The announcement drew media attention from across New England, as Rita's case had become one of Vermont's most well-known cold cases. Chief Murad was joined at the press conference by Detective Amanda Foster, Vermont State Attorney Sarah George, and most importantly, Patricia Kern Walsh, Rita's sister who had fought for justice for 52 years. Today, we can finally say with certainty that we know who killed Rita Kern, Chief Murad announced. Through advances in DNA technology and the dedicated work of our investigators, we have identified William DeRusa as the man responsible for Rita's death. The chief explained how genetic genealogy had led to DeRusa's identification and how DNA evidence had confirmed that he was Rita's killer. He praised the work of Detective Foster and the scientists at Parabon Nanolabs, calling their collaboration a perfect example of how modern forensic science can bring justice to cold cases. But the most powerful moment of the press conference came when Patricia Kern Walsh stepped to the microphone. Now 73 years old, Patricia had spent most of her adult life advocating for her sister's case. Her voice was strong and clear as she addressed the gathered reporters. For 52 years, my family has lived with the pain of not knowing who killed my sister Rita, Patricia said. Rita was a beautiful person who dedicated her life to teaching children. She was going to make such a difference in this world, and that was stolen from her when she was just 24 years old. Patricia thanked the investigators who had worked on Rita's case over the decades, particularly Detective Foster and the original investigating officer, Robert Morrison, who had died in 2018 without seeing the case solved. Detective Morrison made a promise to my family that he would never give up on Rita's case, Patricia said. He kept that promise until the day he died, and his dedication inspired everyone who came after him. I know he would be so proud to see this day. Patricia also spoke about the importance of genetic genealogy in solving cold cases, calling it a miracle of science that can bring answers to families who have waited decades for the truth. The press conference also addressed the fact that William DeRusa could not be prosecuted because he had died in 1986. While some might see this as a limitation of the justice system, Patricia viewed it differently. Justice isn't always about punishment, she explained to reporters. Sometimes justice is simply knowing the truth. For 52 years, Rita's killer walked free while we wondered and worried and searched for answers. Now we know who he was, and we know that he can never hurt anyone else ever again. Detective Foster also spoke at the press conference, explaining the technical aspects of how the case was solved while being careful not to reveal information that might compromise other ongoing investigations. She emphasized that Rita's case was just one of many cold cases that could potentially benefit from genetic genealogy. "This technology is revolutionizing cold case investigations," Foster said. "We're able to solve cases that seemed impossible just a few years ago." Rita's case shows that time doesn't diminish the importance of seeking justice for victims and their families. The announcement made national news, with stories appearing in major newspapers and on television networks across the country. The case was featured on several true crime podcasts and documentary programs, helping to raise awareness about both genetic genealogy and the importance of preserving evidence in cold cases. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from Rita's former students, many of whom were now in their 60s and 70s. Dozens of people who had been in Rita's fourth-grade class reached out to Patricia after the press conference, sharing memories of their beloved teacher and expressing gratitude that her case had finally been solved. "Miss Curran taught me to love reading," wrote Margaret Thompson, who had been in Rita's class in 1970. "She made every child feel special and important. Learning that her killer has been identified brings some peace to those of us who never forgot her." David Henderson, who had spoken to reporters years earlier about Rita's impact on his life, attended the press conference with several other former students. They presented Patricia with a scrapbook filled with memories and photographs from Rita's teaching years, including artwork that Rita had saved from her students and letters she had written to parents. "Rita saved everything," David explained. "Every drawing, every thank you note, every little achievement by her students. She kept it all because she truly cared about each and every one of us. We wanted her family to have these memories." The solution of Rita Curran's case had impacts that extended far beyond Burlington, Vermont. Within weeks of the announcement, police departments across New England began receiving calls from other agencies interested in using genetic genealogy to solve their own cold cases. The Vermont State Police created a new cold case unit specifically focused on using genetic genealogy techniques. Detective Foster was promoted and put in charge of the unit, which began reviewing hundreds of unsolved cases from across the state. "Rita's case proved that no case is too old to solve," Foster explained. "We have evidence from cases going back to the 1960s that might yield results with these new techniques. Every victim deserves the same dedication that Rita received." The success also led to increased funding for cold case investigations. The Vermont legislature passed a bill allocating additional resources for genetic genealogy testing, and several private donors contributed money specifically for solving cases involving violence against women. Patricia Curran-Walsh became an advocate for genetic genealogy, speaking at conferences and working with victim advocacy groups to promote the technology. She testified before the Vermont legislature about the importance of maintaining evidence in cold cases, even when they seemed unsolvable. 52 years ago, the investigators who worked Rita's case made a decision to preserve every piece of evidence, even though they had no idea how it might eventually be used, Patricia told lawmakers. "That decision is the reason we have answers today. We need to make sure that future investigators have the same tools and resources." The identification of William DeRoos also prompted a review of other unsolved cases from the 1970s and 1980s. Investigators found several cases that shared similarities with Rita's murder: young women attacked in their homes, evidence of sexual assault, and signs of extreme violence. Detective Foster worked with agencies in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and New York to compare evidence from these cases with DeRoos's DNA profile. While no additional matches were found, the process helped eliminate DeRoos as a suspect in several other cases, allowing those investigations to focus on other potential perpetrators. The case also had implications for how investigators approach cold cases involving deceased suspects. Traditional police work often focuses on building cases that can be prosecuted in court, but genetic genealogy can provide answers even when prosecution is impossible. "We learned that solving a case doesn't always mean getting a conviction," Chief Murad explained. "Sometimes the most important thing is giving families the truth they've been seeking. That's a different kind of justice," but it's still justice. 6 months after the press conference announcing the solution of Rita's case, the Burlington School District held a special ceremony to honor her memory and the impact she had made during her brief teaching career. The event was held at Champlain Elementary School, where Rita had taught 4th grade more than 50 years earlier. The school had changed significantly since Rita's time. The old red brick building had been renovated and expanded, and new technology filled classrooms that had once relied on chalkboards and mimeograph machines. But the spirit of education and caring that Rita had embodied remained at the heart of the school's mission. Current 4th grade teacher Jennifer Martinez had spent weeks preparing her students for the ceremony. She had told them about Miss Curran, the teacher who had worked in their school long before they were born, and how she had made learning an adventure for every child in her classroom. Miss Curran believed that every student had something special to offer, Martinez told her class. She saw the potential in every child, just like we do today. Even though she's not with us anymore, her spirit of caring and teaching lives on in this school. The ceremony began with remarks from Superintendent Dr. Michael Roberts, who had researched Rita's teaching methods and found them remarkably progressive for their time. Rita had used innovative reading techniques, hands-on science experiments, and creative writing exercises that were ahead of their time. Rita Curran was the kind of teacher who changes lives, Dr. Roberts said. In just 3 years of teaching, she touched hundreds of students and their families. We can only imagine the impact she would have had if her life hadn't been cut short. Patricia Curran Walsh was the keynote speaker at the ceremony. She spoke about Rita's childhood dreams of becoming a teacher, her dedication to her students, and her plans for continuing her education. Patricia also shared personal memories of her sister, how Rita would practice teaching with her dolls as a child, how excited she got when talking about her students, and how she always believed that education could solve the world's problems. Rita used to say that teaching wasn't just a job, it was a calling, Patricia told the audience. She felt called to help children learn and grow and discover their potential. That calling was answered in the 3 years she taught here, and it continues to inspire teachers today. The ceremony also featured remarks from several of Rita's former students, now senior citizens themselves. They shared stories about Rita's teaching methods, her kindness, and the ways she had influenced their lives. Mary Ellen Kowalski, who had struggled with reading until Rita worked with her individually, spoke about how Rita's patience and encouragement had changed her life. Miss Curran never gave up on me, even when I wanted to give up on myself, Mary Ellen said. She saw something in me that I didn't see in myself, and she helped me become the person I am today. Robert Chin described how Rita had encouraged his interest in science, providing him with extra books and experiments that had ultimately led to his career as an engineer. Miss Curran didn't just teach us facts and figures, he said. She taught us to ask questions, to be curious about the world, and to never stop learning. The ceremony concluded with the dedication of a memorial garden on the school grounds. The garden featured Rita's favorite flowers, daisies, and a bronze plaque that read, "In memory of Rita Marie Curran, 1947 to 1971. Beloved teacher, devoted sister, inspiration to all who knew her." Her legacy lives on in every child who discovers the joy of learning. Patricia planted the first daisy in the garden, with help from current 4th grade students who promised to care for the flowers as part of their science curriculum. As she knelt in the soil, Patricia thought about Rita's love of gardening and how appropriate it was that her memory would be honored with growing things. Rita would have loved this, Patricia said quietly. She always said that teaching was like gardening, you plant seeds of knowledge and watch them grow into something beautiful. The solution of Rita Curran's case came at a time when genetic genealogy was rapidly evolving as a forensic tool. Rita's case was featured in academic papers, law enforcement training programs, and conferences about advances in cold case investigations. Dr. Ellen Gradick, who had led the genetic genealogy analysis at Parabon Nanolabs, used Rita's case as an example in her presentations about the potential and limitations of the technology. She emphasized that genetic genealogy was not a magic solution but rather a powerful tool that required skilled investigators and careful analysis. The Rita Curran case shows both the power and the responsibility that comes with genetic genealogy, Dr. Gradick explained at a forensic science conference. We were able to identify her killer after 52 years, but that identification was only the beginning. Investigators still had to do the hard work of confirming the match and understanding the evidence. The case also raised important questions about privacy and ethics in genetic genealogy. Some critics argued that using public genealogy databases for law enforcement purposes violated people's privacy expectations, while supporters countered that solving serious crimes justified the use of voluntarily submitted genetic information. Detective Foster became a frequent speaker at law enforcement conferences, sharing the techniques and approaches that had led to success in Rita's case. She emphasized the importance of preserving evidence, maintaining detailed case files, and never giving up on seeking justice for victims. Every piece of evidence matters, Foster would tell audiences of investigators. We don't know what technology will be available in the future, so we have to preserve everything and document everything. The evidence that solves a case might be something we don't even recognize as important today. Foster also spoke about the emotional aspects of working cold cases, particularly cases involving deceased suspects. She described the challenge of providing closure to families when traditional justice through prosecution wasn't possible. Families of cold case victims live with uncertainty for years or even decades, Foster explained. They wonder who killed their loved one, whether that person is still alive, whether they might strike again. Even when we can't prosecute someone because they're dead, providing answers to those questions is incredibly important. The success of Rita's case led to the formation of the New England Cold Case Initiative, a collaborative effort between law enforcement agencies in 6 states to share resources and expertise in solving old cases. The initiative focused particularly on cases involving violence against women, recognizing that such crimes were often underinvestigated in earlier eras. Within 2 years of Rita's case being solved, the initiative had reopened more than 200 cold cases and achieved solutions in 37 of them. Many of these cases involved genetic genealogy, but others were solved through traditional investigative techniques that had been enhanced by modern technology and better understanding of criminal behavior. As investigators and researchers studied the Rita Curran case, several important lessons emerged about cold case investigations, genetic genealogy, and the importance of persistence in seeking justice. The first lesson was about the value of preserving evidence. Dr. Patricia Manning, the medical examiner who had handled Rita's case in 1971, had made decisions about evidence preservation that proved crucial 52 years later. Her foresight in properly storing biological evidence had made the genetic genealogy analysis possible. Dr. Manning couldn't have known about DNA testing when she worked Rita's case, Detective Foster noted. But she understood that evidence might become more valuable as science advanced. Her professionalism and attention to detail made justice possible decades later. This lesson led to changes in evidence preservation protocols across Vermont and other states. New guidelines required that biological evidence be preserved indefinitely in violent crime cases, and additional funding was allocated for proper storage facilities and equipment. The second lesson involved the importance of maintaining detailed case files. Detective Robert Morrison's meticulous documentation of the original investigation had provided crucial context for the genetic genealogy analysis. His interview notes, evidence logs, and investigative reports had helped modern investigators understand the case and confirm the significance of the DNA match. Morrison's work in 1971 was the foundation for everything we accomplished in 2023, Foster explained. He couldn't solve the case with the technology available to him, but he did everything right in terms of documenting the investigation. That documentation was essential to our success. The third lesson concerned the value of community involvement in cold cases. Rita's case had remained in the public consciousness for decades because of her sister Patricia's advocacy and the impact Rita had made as a teacher. This ongoing attention had helped keep the case active and had provided investigators with resources and support. Cold cases can't be solved in isolation, Chief Murad observed. They require community support, family involvement, and institutional commitment. Rita's case succeeded because so many people refused to give up on finding answers. The fourth lesson was about the limitations of genetic genealogy. While the technology had provided the crucial breakthrough in Rita's case, it had required confirmation through traditional investigative methods. The genetic genealogy analysis had identified William DeRoos as a person of interest, but investigators had still needed to research his background, locate family members, and obtain comparison DNA samples. Genetic genealogy is a powerful tool, but it's not a complete solution, Dr. Gradick emphasized. It provides leads that still need to be investigated and confirmed through other means. The technology works best when it's combined with skilled detective work. The final lesson involved the different meanings of justice. Rita's case couldn't result in a criminal prosecution because DeRoos had died decades earlier, but the identification of her killer had still provided meaningful justice to her family and community. Justice isn't always about punishment, Patricia Curran-Walsh reflected. Sometimes it's about truth, about answers, about finally understanding what happened to someone you loved. We got that truth for Rita, and that's a form of justice that's just as important as a conviction. 5 years after William DeRoos was identified as Rita Curran's killer, the impact of the case continues to be felt across law enforcement, forensic science, and the Burlington community. Rita's story has become a symbol of how persistence, technology, and community commitment can bring justice even decades after a crime. The Rita Curran Memorial Scholarship at the University of Vermont has grown into one of the largest education scholarships in the state, providing funding for dozens of students pursuing careers in elementary education. Recipients of the scholarship are required to spend time volunteering in local schools, carrying on Rita's commitment to helping children learn and grow. Sarah Mitchell, a recent scholarship recipient, spent her volunteer hours working with struggling readers at Champlain Elementary. Learning about Rita's story made me realize how important it is to see potential in every child, Sarah explained. She believed that every student could succeed, and that belief is something I want to carry into my own teaching career. The Memorial Garden at Champlain Elementary has become a place of reflection and learning. Each spring, 4th grade students plant new flowers and learn about Rita's teaching methods and philosophy. The garden serves as both a memorial to Rita and a reminder of the impact that dedicated teachers can have on their students' lives. Detective Amanda Foster continues to lead Vermont's Cold Case Unit, which has achieved notable success in solving decades-old crimes. The unit has resolved more than 60 cases since Rita's murder was solved, providing answers to families who had waited years for justice. Rita's case showed us what was possible, Foster said on the 5th anniversary of the solution. It gave us the confidence and the resources to tackle other cold cases that had seemed unsolvable. Every case we solve now is built on the foundation of what we learned from Rita's investigation. Foster has also become a national expert in applying genetic genealogy to cold cases, consulting with law enforcement agencies across the country. She credits Rita's case with launching her career in this specialized field. I never expected that working one cold case would change my entire career path, Foster admitted. But Rita's case showed me the incredible impact that these investigations can have on families and communities. It's work that matters, and that's what gets me up every morning. Patricia Curran-Walsh, now in her late 70s, remains active in victim advocacy and cold case support. She has worked with dozens of other families who are seeking answers in unsolved cases, providing guidance and emotional support based on her own decades-long journey. Rita's case taught me that you should never give up hope, Patricia says. Justice might take 50 years, but it can still come. I want other families to know that their loved ones matter, that their cases matter, and that there are people who will keep fighting for answers. Patricia has also written a book about Rita's life and the long journey to justice, titled The Teacher's Gift, A Sister's Search for Truth. The book has become a bestseller in the true crime genre and has raised additional funds for cold case investigations and victim support services. The book focuses not just on Rita's murder and its solution, but on Rita's life and the positive impact she had during her brief time as a teacher. Patricia wanted to ensure that Rita was remembered for how she lived, not just for how she died. Rita was so much more than a victim, Patricia writes in the book's introduction. She was a daughter, a sister, a teacher, and a friend. She had dreams and plans and so much love to give. I wanted people to know who she really was, not just what happened to her. The success of genetic genealogy in Rita's case contributed to rapid advances in the field, with new techniques and technologies emerging that make it possible to solve even more challenging cold cases. Researchers have developed methods for analyzing smaller and more degraded DNA samples, expanding the range of cases that can be addressed. Dr. Ellen Gradick and her team at Parabon Nanolabs have refined their techniques based on lessons learned from cases like Rita's. They've developed new approaches for building family trees from genetic data and have created software tools that make the analysis more efficient and accurate. Rita's case was one of our early successes with genetic genealogy, and it taught us a lot about how to approach these investigations, Dr. Gradick explained. We've been able to apply those lessons to hundreds of other cases, each one helping us refine our methods and improve our success rate. The field has also grappled with ethical and legal challenges that have emerged as genetic genealogy has become more widely used. Courts have had to address questions about privacy rights, the admissibility of genetic genealogy evidence, and the proper procedures for conducting these investigations. The Rita Curran case has become a model for how genetic genealogy investigations should be conducted, with careful attention to scientific rigor, legal procedures, and respect for the privacy rights of both victims and suspects. Law enforcement agencies across the country study Rita's case when developing their own genetic genealogy programs. Rita's case shows how to do genetic genealogy right, said Professor Michael Torres, who teaches forensic science at Boston University. The investigators were careful, thorough, and ethical in their approach. They confirmed their results through multiple methods and treated all parties with respect and dignity. The case has also influenced legislation in several states, with new laws governing the use of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations. These laws typically require court approval for genetic genealogy searches and establish protocols for protecting the privacy of individuals whose genetic information is used in investigations. Vermont passed the Rita Curran Act in 2023, which provides funding for genetic genealogy investigations while establishing strict guidelines for how the technology can be used. The law requires that genetic genealogy only be used in cases of violent crime, that all searches be approved by a judge, and that the genetic information of innocent relatives be protected. Rita's case showed us the incredible potential of genetic genealogy, said State Senator Maria Rodriguez, who sponsored the legislation. But it also showed us the need for careful oversight and protection of individual privacy rights. This law ensures that we can continue to solve cold cases while respecting the rights of all citizens. On July 19, 2024, exactly 53 years after Rita Curran's murder, Patricia Curran Walsh stood in the Memorial Garden at Champlain Elementary School, surrounded by Rita's former students, their children and grandchildren, and members of the Burlington community who had never forgotten their beloved teacher. The occasion was the dedication of a new addition to the memorial, a bronze statue of Rita sitting on a bench, reading a book to an imaginary group of children. The statue had been commissioned using funds raised by Rita's former students and was created by a local artist who had been inspired by stories of Rita's dedication to her students. Rita always said that teaching was about planting seeds that would grow long after you were gone, Patricia said to the gathered crowd. Looking at all of you here today, her former students, their children, the teachers who were inspired by her story, I can see that those seeds are still growing. The ceremony included readings from some of Rita's lesson plans, which had been preserved in the school's archives. Her innovative teaching methods, which had seemed so advanced in 1971, were still being used by teachers more than 50 years later. Current fourth-grade teacher Michael Rodriguez, no relation to the senator, spoke about how Rita's teaching philosophy continued to influence education at Champlain Elementary. We still use some of the reading techniques that Miss Curran developed, he explained. Her belief that every child can learn, that every student has something valuable to contribute, that's at the heart of everything we do here. Detective Foster, now nearing retirement after a distinguished career in cold case investigations, spoke about the ongoing impact of Rita's case on law enforcement. Since Rita's murder was solved, Foster's unit had resolved more than 100 cold cases, bringing justice to families across Vermont and beyond. Rita's case changed how we think about cold cases, Foster said. It showed us that no case is ever truly closed, that advances in science and technology can always provide new opportunities for justice. But more than that, it reminded us why this work matters, because every victim deserves to be remembered, and every family deserves answers. Foster announced that she would be donating her papers from Rita's case to the University of Vermont's Criminal Justice Program, where they would be used to train future investigators in cold case techniques and genetic genealogy. The ceremony concluded with the planting of new flowers in the memorial garden by Rita's former students and their families. Each person planted a daisy, Rita's favorite flower, while sharing a memory of how Rita had influenced their lives. David Henderson, now in his 70s and a retired professor, planted his flower while remembering the shy 9-year-old boy who had struggled with reading until Rita helped him discover his love of books. "Miss Curran saw something in me that I didn't see in myself," David said. "She taught me that learning was an adventure, that every book was a doorway to a new world. That lesson shaped my entire life, and I've tried to pass it on to my own students over the years." Margaret Thompson, Rita's former student who had become a successful businesswoman, spoke about how Rita's encouragement had given her the confidence to pursue her dreams. "Miss Curran always told us that we could accomplish anything if we worked hard and believed in ourselves," Margaret said. "She was the first person who ever told me I was smart, and that belief changed everything for me." As the sun set over Burlington that evening, Patricia Curran Walsh walked slowly through the memorial garden, touching each of the flowers that had been planted in Rita's memory. After 55 years of fighting for justice, after decades of wondering and waiting and hoping, she finally felt a sense of peace. Rita's killer had been identified. Her memory had been honored. Her legacy as a teacher continued to inspire new generations of educators and students. And perhaps most importantly, the love that Rita had shown to her students during her brief career continued to ripple outward, touching lives she could never have imagined. "Rita always believed that love and learning could change the world," Patricia whispered to the evening air. "I think she was right." The story of Rita Curran's murder and the 52-year journey to justice teaches us several profound lessons about persistence, hope, and the enduring power of love. It reminds us that justice delayed is not always justice denied, that advances in science and technology can provide new paths to truth, even decades after a crime. Rita's case shows us the importance of preserving evidence, maintaining detailed records, and never giving up on seeking answers for victims and their families. But perhaps more importantly, Rita's story reminds us that every life has value, that every person matters, and that the impact of one dedicated individual can ripple through generations. Rita Curran taught 4th grade for only 3 years, but her influence on her students lasted a lifetime and beyond. The former students who attended Rita's memorial service, now senior citizens themselves, carry her lessons with them every day. They pass her teachings on to their children and grandchildren, ensuring that Rita's gift for education continues to touch new lives more than 50 years after her death. The investigators who worked Rita's case, from Detective Morrison in 1971 to Detective Foster in 2023, were motivated not just by a desire to solve a crime, but by a commitment to honor Rita's memory and provide answers to her family. Their dedication reminds us that some causes are worth fighting for, regardless of how long the fight might take. Patricia Curran Walsh's 52-year quest for justice shows us the power of love and determination. Her refusal to give up, her advocacy for other victims' families, and her work to preserve Rita's memory demonstrate that grief can be transformed into purpose, that loss can become a force for positive change. The Burlington community's response to Rita's murder and the eventual solution of her case illustrates how tragedy can bring people together, how shared loss can create lasting bonds, and how collective memory can keep important stories alive across generations. And the advances in genetic genealogy that finally identified Rita's killer remind us that science and technology, when used ethically and responsibly, can be powerful tools for justice and healing. Rita Curran began her teaching career believing that education could change the world. Her life was cut tragically short, but her final lesson, that love, persistence, and hope can overcome even the darkest circumstances, continues to inspire all who hear her story. In classrooms across Vermont and beyond, her teaching methods are still being used. In cold case units around the country, her case continues to provide hope and guidance to investigators working on unsolved crimes. In the hearts of her former students and their families, her memory lives on as a reminder of the transformative power of a dedicated teacher. Rita Curran's murder was solved on March 15, 2023, 52 years after her death. But her story didn't end with the identification of her killer. It continued with every life she had touched, every student she had inspired, and every person who was moved by her example to make a positive difference in the world. That, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all, that while evil may triumph temporarily, love and goodness have the power to endure forever. Rita Curran's legacy is not defined by how she died, but by how she lived, and by how her life continues to inspire others to live with purpose, compassion, and hope. The teacher's final lesson is this: that every act of kindness, every moment of inspiration, every effort to help another person learn and grow creates ripples that extend far beyond what we can see or imagine. Rita Curran planted seeds of knowledge and compassion that are still growing today, more than half a century after her death. And in that growth, in that continuing impact, in that enduring legacy of love and learning, Rita Curran achieved a kind of immortality that no killer could ever take away. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.